The relentless howl of the wind drowned her screams as Catherine Wilson collapsed to her knees in the snow. The lantern light faded into the distance, her husband Edward not once looking back as he rode away, leaving her to the mercy of the Black Ridge Mountains. Her fingers, already numb, clawed desperately at the frozen ground as the first flakes of the blizzard began to fall. This wasn't merely abandonment. This was a death sentence. "I won't die here," she whispered, her voice immediately swallowed by the storm. "I won't give him the satisfaction." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But as night descended and the temperature plummeted, even Catherine's iron will began to waver. She had been the daughter of a trapper, had survived 15 harsh Wyoming winters, but never alone, never without shelter, never betrayed by the one person who had vowed to protect her. As consciousness began to slip away, a shadow moved through the swirling snow, not the shadow of death, but of salvation. A figure on horseback, tracking imperceptible signs that somehow led straight to her. The last thing Catherine saw before darkness claimed her was a hand reaching down, not to harm, but to rescue. The memory of Edward's face haunted Catherine as she drifted between consciousness and oblivion. The cruel twist of his mouth, the cold calculation in his eyes as he led her into the mountains under the pretense of checking trap lines. How easily the mask of love had slipped away after 5 years of marriage, revealing the monster beneath. "You've become a burden, Cat," he'd said, his voice as sharp as the winter air. "The claim on your father's land was all I ever wanted. Now that it's legally mine, you're just another mouth to feed." She'd laughed at first, certain he was playing some twisted joke. But then came the shove that sent her tumbling into the snow, the click of his rifle hammer, the ultimatum. "Walk back if you can. I won't waste a bullet on you." Then he was gone, taking her horse, her supplies, even her heavy coat, leaving her in a simple woolen dress, miles from civilization, as the sky darkened with impending snow. Catherine had started walking immediately, knowing that to remain still meant certain death. The first hour had brought determination, the second doubt, the third despair. By the fourth, her steps had become shuffles, her body temperature dropping dangerously with each passing minute. When she fell for what would be the last time, Catherine's thoughts weren't of Edward or revenge, but of her father. How disappointed he would be to know that the strength he'd instilled in her hadn't been enough, that the land he'd worked so hard to claim would pass to the man who had murdered his daughter through abandonment. The injustice of it burned, even as her body grew cold. Swift Eagle had not been looking for a white woman when he'd set out that morning. The young Cheyenne tracker had been hunting, seeking game to bring back to Eagle Feather Camp, where his people had established their winter settlement. But the strange tracks caught his attention, a horse carrying a heavy load, followed by the irregular footprints of someone struggling through deep snow. Something about the pattern spoke of wrongness, of something unnatural. A hunter's instinct, or perhaps the guidance of spirits, urged him to follow, though the coming storm warned against it. When he found Catherine half buried in snow, her lips blue and fingers curled like claws, he recognized not just a woman, but a crime. Swift Eagle worked quickly, wrapping her in his spare buffalo robe, lifting her onto his horse. He spoke softly in Cheyenne, not expecting her to understand, but hoping the human voice might anchor her spirit to this world. "Fight, pale woman," he murmured. "The night is long, but you must fight." Catherine was not the only woman to face the cruelty of Pinecrest Valley that winter. In the weeks before, others had been cast out, discarded by a community that viewed women without men as burdens rather than people deserving of compassion. Mary Bradshaw had been the first, accused of stealing from the general store where she worked after her husband died in a logging accident. No evidence was presented, no trial conducted. The store owner, who had made advances she'd rejected, simply declared her guilty, and the town complied with her removal. Rebecca Doyle followed shortly after. Once respected as the town's schoolteacher, she dared question Reverend Hughes's fiery sermons condemning the heathen savages who'd lived on the land long before the settlers arrived. The Reverend's influence proved stronger than her years of service, and she found herself evicted from the schoolhouse that had been both her workplace and home. Grace Miller, barely 20 and newly widowed when her husband's claim was jumped by his own brother, fought back with a shotgun. For her defiance, she was branded dangerous and unstable. The town turned a blind eye when her brother-in-law and his friends drove her to the edge of town and told her never to return. Abigail Fletcher, her hands gnarled with arthritis but her mind still sharp, made the mistake of using herbal remedies when Dr. Thompson's expensive treatments failed to ease her pain. Whispers of witchcraft spread quickly in a town already looking for scapegoats for a harsh winter and poor harvest. Sheriff Tate himself escorted her beyond the town limits, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small bundle of her sinful herbs. These women, unlike Catherine, had found each other. Drawn together by desperation and the primal need for survival, they'd established a meager camp in a cave near Widow's Creek. Each day was a struggle, but together they'd managed to keep the flame of life burning, gathering firewood, setting snares for rabbits, sharing body heat through the coldest nights. They had no way of knowing that Catherine Wilson would soon join their ranks, or that their fates would intertwine with the Cheyenne, who most of Pinecrest Valley viewed with suspicion and fear. Catherine awoke to unfamiliar sounds and sensations. The crackle of fire, the scent of pine smoke mixed with something herbal and unfamiliar, the soft murmur of voices speaking a language she didn't understand. Her body felt impossibly heavy, yet somehow disconnected, as if she were floating just above it, tethered by the thinnest of threads. She tried to move, to open her eyes, but could manage only a faint moan. Immediately the voices quieted, and she felt a presence beside her. "Be still," a woman's voice said in accented but clear English. "Your body is between worlds. To move too quickly is to risk losing yourself." Catherine forced her eyes open, vision blurry at first, but slowly focusing on the face before her. A native woman, perhaps a few years older than herself, dark eyes studying her with a mixture of caution and concern. "Where?" Catherine managed, her throat painfully dry. "You are in Eagle Feather Camp," the woman replied, lifting Catherine's head slightly to help her drink from a small wooden bowl. The liquid was bitter, but not unpleasant, spreading warmth down her throat and into her chest. "My brother found you in the snow. I am Morning Star." "Catherine," she whispered in response, then added, "Cat." Morning Star nodded, seemingly pleased that Catherine was lucid enough to provide her name. "You were close to walking the spirit path, Cat. Another hour in the storm, and not even our strongest medicine could have called you back." The brutal reality of her situation came flooding back. Edward's betrayal, the mountain, the cold. Catherine closed her eyes again, a single tear escaping before she could master herself. "My husband," she said, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "He left me to die." Morning Star's expression didn't change, but something hardened in her eyes. "Yes, my brother saw the tracks. One horse carrying two, then returning with one. This is not the way of honorable men." A shadow fell across the entrance to what Catherine now recognized as some kind of lodge or tent. A tall figure ducked inside. The man who had rescued her, she presumed. He spoke briefly to Morning Star in Cheyenne before turning his attention to Catherine. "You are awake," he said, his English more hesitant than his sister's. "This is good. I am Swift Eagle." "You saved my life," Catherine said. "Thank you." Swift Eagle regarded her for a long moment, his face impassive. Why would a man leave his wife to die in the snow? The directness of the question caught Catherine off guard. Among her people, such matters might be approached more delicately, or not at all. But there was no judgment in Swift Eagle's tone, only a desire to understand. "For land," she answered honestly. "My father's land. Now that it bears my husband's name, I became unnecessary." Swift Eagle exchanged a glance with his sister, some unspoken communication passing between them. "The white man's hunger for land is a sickness we know well," he said finally. Catherine tried to sit up, ignoring the protest of her frozen limbs. This time, Morning Star helped her rather than restraining her, adjusting the furs to keep her warm. "I need to return to Pinecrest," Catherine said, though the thought of facing Edward again sent ice through her veins that had nothing to do with her recent exposure. "To seek vengeance?" Swift Eagle asked, studying her face carefully. Catherine hesitated. The need for justice burned within her, but she was clear-eyed enough to know that the word of a woman, especially one presumed dead, would carry little weight against a man's in frontier society. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "To reclaim what's mine," she said finally, "and to ensure he cannot do this to another woman when I'm gone." Swift Eagle seemed to approve of this answer, giving a slight nod. "First, you must heal. Then we will speak of Pinecrest." As the days passed, Catherine's strength slowly returned under Morning Star's careful attention. The healer applied salves to her frost-bitten extremities, brewed teas that cleared the congestion from her lungs, and ensured she ate small, frequent meals to rebuild her strength. The lodge she occupied sat at the edge of Eagle Feather Camp, a winter settlement of about 20 lodges. Catherine learned that this was not the Cheyenne's permanent home, but a protected valley where they spent the harshest winter months before returning to their usual territories in spring. On her 5th day, when she could finally stand without assistance, Morning Star brought her proper clothing, a dress of soft deerskin, leggings and moccasins, all warmly lined and far more practical than the sodden woolen dress she'd been wearing when Swift Eagle found her. "These belong to our cousin," Morning Star explained. "She walks with the ancestors now." Catherine accepted the gift with appropriate solemnity. "I will honor her memory by using them well." That afternoon, supported by Morning Star, she ventured outside for the first time. The camp sprawled before her, nestled in a sheltered valley surrounded by pine forests. Children played in the snow. Women worked scraping hides or mending clothing. Men repaired weapons or smoked around small fires, discussing hunting prospects. Many paused to watch her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to guarded suspicion. Catherine couldn't blame them. White people had given the Cheyenne little reason to trust them. Swift Eagle approached, returning from what appeared to be a hunting expedition, a brace of rabbits hanging from his belt. He nodded in acknowledgement of her improved condition. "You stand stronger today," he observed. "Thanks to your people's kindness," Catherine replied. "Some question that kindness," he said frankly. "They ask why we save a white woman when white men have brought us nothing but sorrow." Catherine met his gaze directly. "A fair question. I have no answer except that I am not my husband, nor am I all white people. I'm just one woman, grateful to be alive." Swift Eagle studied her for a long moment, then surprised her with the ghost of a smile. "A good answer. Come, there is something you should see." He led her to the edge of the camp, pointing toward a distant ridge, where the dark mouth of a cave was just visible. "There," he said, "4 white women, like you, cast away by your people." Catherine squinted against the bright snow, disbelieving at first, then stunned. "Others? Here?" "Not here," Swift Eagle corrected. "They do not trust us enough to accept our shelter." They survive together barely. Sometimes, when they do not, see, we leave meat or firewood. The revelation struck Catherine like a physical blow. She was not alone in her abandonment. Other women had faced similar cruelty and found a way to survive. "I need to meet them," she said, determination. Replacing shock, Swift Eagle studied her face, then nodded. "Tomorrow, if your strength allows. Not alone. The woods hold dangers, and you are not yet whole." That night, Catherine lay awake, staring at the smoke hole at the top of the lodge, watching stars appear and disappear as wispy clouds passed overhead. Her thoughts raced between Edward's betrayal, the mysterious women at the cave, and the unexpected kindness of the Cheyenne who had every reason to let her die. One thing became increasingly clear as night deepened toward dawn. Surviving was only the beginning. What mattered now was what she would do with the life that had been returned to her. Morning brought both anticipation and apprehension. Catherine ate the simple breakfast Morning Star provided, a porridge of ground corn mixed with dried berries, then prepared for the journey to the cave. Though the distance wasn't great, her body was still recovering, and she knew each step would tax her limited reserves. Swift Eagle arrived as promised, carrying an extra fur robe and a walking stick carved from ash. "For you," he said, offering the stick. "The path is uneven." Catherine accepted it gratefully. "Thank you for everything." He shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "We go now. Stay close." The journey took longer than Catherine anticipated. What might have been a 30-minute walk for someone at full strength required nearly 2 hours in her weakened state. Swift Eagle set a patient pace, stopping often to allow her to rest, neither hurrying her nor offering unwanted assistance. As they approached the cave, he held up a hand, signaling her to stop. "They have traps," he explained quietly, "not for animals, for people." Catherine's heart constricted at the thought of women so afraid they would set traps against potential rescuers. What horrors had they endured to reach such a state? Swift Eagle called out in English, his voice carrying across the snowy clearing that separated them from the cave entrance. "I bring no harm. I bring one like you." For several long moments there was no response. Then a figure appeared at the mouth of the cave. A woman with long grey hair and a face lined with age and hardship. "Show yourselves properly," she demanded, her ancient pistol clutched in gnarled hands. Swift Eagle stepped fully into the clearing, gesturing for Catherine to do the same. She moved forward on unsteady legs, leaning heavily on the walking stick. "My name is Catherine Wilson," she called. "My husband left me to die in the blizzard 5 days ago. This man saved my life." The older woman's grip on the pistol didn't waver. "Why come here?" "Because I was told there were others, women who survived what was meant to destroy them." Catherine took another step forward. "Women like me." A second figure appeared beside the older woman, younger, with auburn hair and a fading bruise visible on her cheek. "Let them approach, Abigail," she said. "The Indian has left game for us before. He could have harmed us already if that was his intention." Reluctantly, Abigail lowered the pistol. "Come then, but he stays at the entrance." Swift Eagle nodded, his understanding. "I will wait," he told Catherine. "Go carefully." Catherine made her way forward, each step a challenge on the uneven, snow-covered ground. By the time she reached the cave entrance, she was breathing heavily, her legs trembling with exertion. The younger woman reached out to steady her. "You really are in bad shape," she said, her voice softer now. "I'm Mary Bradshaw. Catherine Wilson, Cat." "Well, Cat, you'd better come inside before you collapse. Again." The cave opening was narrow, but opened into a surprisingly spacious interior. A small fire burned in the center, the smoke finding its way out through a natural chimney in the rock ceiling. Around the fire sat 2 more women, one who might have been in her 30s, with the composed demeanor of someone educated, and another barely out of girlhood, her face a mask of wariness. "Rebecca," Mary said, gesturing to the composed woman. "Former school teacher until Reverend Hughes decided questioning his sermons was tantamount to blasphemy." Rebecca inclined her head slightly. "Questioning anything in Pinecrest is dangerous, as we've all discovered." "And that's Grace," Mary continued, indicating the youngest. "Her husband died, his brother stole their claim, and when she objected with a shotgun, they decided she was too dangerous to keep around." "Self-defense is only for men, apparently," Grace muttered, poking at the fire with a stick. "And Abigail, you've met," Mary finished, as the older woman shuffled back to her place by the fire. "They called her a witch for using herbs instead of paying the doctors exorbitant fees. If using willow bark for pain makes me a witch, then a witch I am," Abigail declared, unrepentant. Catherine lowered herself carefully to an empty spot by the fire, the warmth a welcome relief after the cold journey. "And you?" she asked Mary. "Widowed 6 months ago, made the mistake of refusing the general store owner's generous offer to work off my debts in his bed. Suddenly I was a thief who needed to be run out of town." Catherine absorbed their stories, recognizing the common thread: women who had become inconvenient, who had stood up for themselves, who had refused to submit to the unjust demands of men in power. "My husband wanted my father's land," she told them. "Once the claim was legally transferred to his name through our marriage, I became expendable. He took me hunting, left me in the mountains, and rode back alone." "Edward Wilson," Rebecca said, her eyes narrowing. "I remember him, always charming in town, especially to the widows and single women." Catherine's stomach clenched. "You think I wasn't his first victim?" "I think," Rebecca said carefully, "that a man who could leave his wife to die might have practiced his cruelty in smaller ways first." The implication hung in the air, that Edward might have courted other vulnerable women, perhaps with similar intentions. "He told everyone you'd run off," Abigail said suddenly. 3 days ago, he was in town crying into his whiskey about his faithless wife who'd abandoned him for some trapper heading to Canada." White-hot rage flashed through Catherine, momentarily banishing her exhaustion. "He's setting the stage for when my body is eventually found, if it ever was, making sure no one would question that I died running away rather than by his hand." "Men like that always protect themselves first," Mary said bitterly. "They're very good at making the victim look guilty." They talked through the afternoon, sharing their stories in greater detail, piecing together a pattern of abuse and injustice that ran through Pinecrest Valley like a poisoned stream. Catherine learned that the women had been surviving primarily on rabbit and squirrel caught in snares, supplemented by mysterious offerings of venison that occasionally appeared near their cave. Swift Eagle's contributions, though they hadn't known the source until now. As daylight began to fade, Catherine reluctantly prepared to leave. Her body ached from the journey and the hard stone of the cave floor, but her spirit felt lighter. Here were women who understood, who had faced their own versions of Edward's betrayal and survived. "Come with me," she urged them, "to the Cheyenne camp. It's warmer, safer." The women exchanged uneasy glances. "We've heard stories all our lives," Rebecca said gently, "about scalping and worse." "Stories told by the same men who left us to die," Catherine countered. "I've been there 5 days now. They've shown me nothing but kindness." "Even so," Mary said, "we've made this place a home of sorts. We have our traps, our routines. Moving now with winter still fierce could be dangerous." Catherine couldn't argue the practical concerns, even as she wished they would reconsider. "Then I'll return, tomorrow or the next day, with supplies." "Why would you help us?" Grace asked, speaking up for the first time in hours. "You barely know us." Catherine thought about this as she struggled to her feet. Because we're alike, she said finally, discarded by those who should have protected us, and because surviving alone isn't enough. We need to do more than just live. We need to reclaim what was taken from us. Pretty words, Abigail said, though her tone held more weariness than skepticism. But what can 5 women do against an entire town that was happy to throw us away? Catherine met the older woman's gaze steadily. I don't know yet, but together we'll find out. Outside, Swift Eagle waited patiently, showing no sign of discomfort despite having spent hours in the cold. He eyed Catherine critically as she emerged, noting her increased fatigue. They do not come? He asked. Catherine shook her head. Not yet. They're afraid. With reason, Swift Eagle acknowledged. My people have suffered much at White Hands. Perhaps they fear the same from us? It's not the same, Catherine said, then paused. Or perhaps it is in some ways. Fear, distrust, stories told to justify cruelty. Swift Eagle helped her navigate back through the forest as dusk settled around them. The return journey was even more difficult, her body protesting each step. Halfway back, her legs simply gave out, buckling beneath her. Without a word, Swift Eagle crouched beside her. I will carry you the rest, he said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Too exhausted to protest, Catherine allowed him to lift her onto his back. As they moved through the gathering darkness, she found herself telling him about the women, their stories, and her growing conviction that something needed to be done, not just for survival, but for justice. Your husband, Swift Eagle said, as the lights of the camp came into view. He thinks you are dead. Yes. This gives you power, he said. The dead can move unseen. Catherine pondered his words as they entered the camp. He was right. Everyone in Pinecrest would believe. Edward's tale of abandonment would expect never to see her again. Her presumed death was a weapon she could use if she was clever enough. Morningstar was waiting at the lodge, her expression shifting from concern to relief as they appeared. She helped Catherine inside, tutting at her obvious exhaustion. You pushed too hard, she scolded, easing Catherine onto the sleeping robes. I had to meet them, Catherine replied, wincing as she stretched out her overtaxed muscles. Morningstar began preparing a tea, adding various dried herbs to a pot of hot water. And now you know you are not alone. This is good, but strength returns slowly, like spring after winter. You cannot rush it. Catherine accepted the steaming cup when it was offered, inhaling the soothing aroma. There isn't time to heal completely. Edward believes me dead, but eventually someone will search the mountain where he left me. When they find nothing, he might grow suspicious. What will you do? Morningstar asked, settling beside her. Catherine sipped the tea, feeling its warmth spread through her tired body. First, I need to regain my strength. Then I need to understand exactly what Edward has done, and to whom. And finally, she said, her voice hardening, I need to make sure he can never harm another woman. Again. Morningstar studied her face in the flickering firelight. Revenge is a path that can poison the walker, she warned. Not revenge, Catherine corrected. Justice. There's a difference. Sometimes the line between them is thinner than a blade of grass, Morningstar replied. Be careful which side you walk on. As Catherine drifted toward sleep, her mind filled with the faces of the women in the cave, Abigail's weathered determination, Mary's bitter resilience, Rebecca's quiet intelligence, Grace's wounded defiance. Women who, like her, had been deemed disposable. But they had survived. And survival, Catherine was beginning to understand, was just the first step on a much longer journey. The weeks that followed tested Catherine in ways she had never imagined. Each dawn brought new challenges, not just the physical recovery, from her near-death experience, but the mental adjustment to her new reality. She was legally dead, at least in the eyes of Pinecrest Valley. Her husband had spun his tale of abandonment, claiming the role of victim while leaving her to freeze in the mountains. The bitter irony was not lost on her. Swift Eagle continued to guide her to the cave every few days, allowing her to build trust with the other outcast women. Each visit revealed more about their situation. The meager supplies they'd managed to salvage or scavenge, the intricate system of snares and warnings they'd established around their sanctuary, the unspoken hierarchy that had formed with Mary, and Rebecca typically making decisions, while Abigail provided wisdom, and Grace contributed youth and energy. "I still think you should consider coming to the Cheyenne camp," Catherine urged during one visit as they huddled around the small fire. The February winds howled outside, a constant reminder of nature's indifference to human suffering. Rebecca shook her head, her educator's patience evident in her tone. "We've discussed this, Kat. The risk is too great, not just from the Cheyenne themselves, though forgive us if we don't immediately trust based on your experience alone, but from being seen associating with them. If anyone from Pinecrest spotted us living among the Cheyenne, they'd have even more justification for what they did to us. And justification for doing worse if we ever tried to return," Mary added, her practical nature always looking ahead to potential consequences. Catherine couldn't argue their logic, though it frustrated her. The division between the white settlers and the Cheyenne was a gulf wider than the Black Ridge itself, built on years of mutual suspicion and occasional violence. That she had somehow found herself in the rare position of moving between these worlds was both a privilege and a burden. "At least let me bring you more supplies," she offered instead. "Morning Star has been teaching me which plants can be gathered even in winter, and Swift Eagle always brings extra game." "We accept the help," Abigail said, her arthritic hands wrapped in strips of rabbit fur to keep them warm. "But we want to be clear about something, girl. We aren't looking for charity. We're surviving until spring, when we can move on to Fort Anderson or maybe even Silverton, somewhere people don't know our stories." Catherine considered the older woman's words. "And that's enough for you? To just start over somewhere else? To let them win?" Mary's eyes flashed. "Staying alive is winning, Kat. Everything else is luxury." The conversation might have ended there, tense and unresolved, if not for the sudden sound that cut through the whistling wind. The distant report of a rifle, followed by another, then several more in quick succession. Grace was on her feet instantly, moving to the narrow gap they used to observe the approach to the cave without being seen. "Riders," she hissed. "6, maybe 7 of them." Catherine joined her, peering through the opening. Her blood froze at the sight of the approaching party. Even at this distance, she recognized the lead rider's posture, the set of his shoulders. "Edward," she whispered. Rebecca appeared at her shoulder. "Your husband, are you certain?" Catherine nodded, unable to form words as panic constricted her throat. What was he doing here? Had someone spotted her journeys between the camp and the cave? Had he somehow discovered she was alive? "They're hunting!" Swift Eagle's voice came from behind them, making all 5 women whirl in surprise. None had heard him enter through the rear passage they kept for emergencies. "How do you know?" Mary demanded, one hand already reaching for the ancient pistol they kept loaded for dire circumstances. Swift Eagle's expression was grim. "They carry empty bags for game, but their eyes look high on the ridges, not low where animals would be. They hunt my people. We have seen such parties before." "What happens if they find your camp?" Catherine asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Death," Swift Eagle said simply. "They would claim we raided their cattle or stole their horses. They need no true reason, just an excuse." The brutal honesty hung in the air between them. Catherine had heard stories of such hunting parties before, though she'd always told herself they were exaggerations. Now, watching her husband lead men with rifles toward the winter home of the people who had saved her life, she could no longer hide from the truth. "We need to warn them," she said. Swift Eagle nodded. "I came to bring you back quickly. The others are already preparing to move deeper into the mountains where the horses cannot follow." Catherine turned to the cave women. "Come with us. It's not safe here anymore." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Mary's resolute face. "If they're hunting Cheyenne, we might be safer staying hidden. They have no reason to look for us here." "Unless they spot tracks between here and the camp," Catherine pointed out. "My tracks, Swift Eagle's tracks, if Edward realizes I'm alive." She didn't need to finish the thought. Edward would not leave loose ends, especially one that could testify to his attempted murder. "We don't have time for debate," Swift Eagle said, his usual stoicism giving way to urgency. "The storm comes. It will cover our retreat, but only if we leave now." Catherine looked at the women who, like her, had been discarded by Pinecrest. "Please," she said simply. It was Grace who answered, the youngest, but in some ways, the most decisive. "I'd rather die moving forward than cowering in a cave. I'm going." One by one, the others nodded their agreement, though Abigail grumbled about her old bones as she gathered her precious herbs into a deerskin pouch. Within minutes, they had collected their few valuable possessions: Rebecca's treasured copy of Emerson's essays, Mary's husband's pocket watch, Grace's father's hunting knife, Abigail's herbs and remedies, everything else they left behind. Survival had taught them the difference between necessities and luxuries. Swift Eagle led them through the rear passage, a narrow tunnel that opened onto a sheer rock face overlooking a steep ravine. A crude rope ladder, fashioned from strips of hide twisted together, provided the only way down. "I can't," Abigail said immediately, peering over the edge. "These hands won't hold. I'll fall." Swift Eagle didn't argue or try to persuade. He simply moved to the older woman's side, securing a length of rope around his waist, and then hers. "I will carry you," he said. "Hold to my shoulders." Abigail hesitated only briefly before clinging to him like a child, her weathered face set in determination as he began the descent, bearing her weight as if it were nothing. One by one they followed, Mary first, then Rebecca, then Grace. Catherine went last, casting a final glance back at the cave that had sheltered these women through months of hardship. It wasn't much of a home, but it had kept them alive when Pinecrest had intended otherwise. The descent was harrowing, the rope ladder swaying in the strengthening wind, ice forming on the rawhide, making each rung treacherous. Catherine's still recovering body protested every movement, muscles trembling with the effort of supporting her weight. Halfway down, her foot slipped and she hung by her arms alone for one terrifying moment before finding purchase again. By the time they reached the bottom, the first heavy flakes of snow were falling. Swift Eagle led them along the ravine floor, their progress slow due to Abigail's limited mobility and the increasingly difficult conditions. The temperature was dropping rapidly, the wind driving needles of ice against any exposed skin. "How much farther?" Rebecca called, her voice nearly lost in the howling of the storm. 3 miles, Swift Eagle replied, "but we cannot go directly. We must use the ravine for cover, then circle back." Catherine did the calculation in her mind. 3 miles as a crow flies, but likely double that with the necessary detour through deepening snow in deteriorating weather. It would be a miracle if they all made it, especially Abigail. As if reading her thoughts, the older woman stumbled, falling to her knees in the snow. "Go!" she gasped. "I'm slowing you down." "No," Catherine said firmly, helping her back to her feet. "We stay together." Mary appeared on Abigail's other side, adding her support. All of us, or none of us. They continued on, each step a battle against the elements and their own exhaustion. The world narrowed to a white blur, their focus reduced to placing one foot in front of the other. Swift Eagle moved between them, sometimes carrying Abigail for short distances, sometimes supporting Grace, whose youth was no match for the brutal cold. Above the storm's fury, Catherine caught a sound that made her blood run cold, the distant bark of dogs. Edward had brought hunting hounds. Swift Eagle heard it too, his expression darkened. "They track us." "How?" Rebecca asked. "In this storm? Dogs follow scent," Swift Eagle explained. "Storm slows them but does not stop them." The implications were clear. Their lead was shrinking. Soon the hunting party would be upon them. Swift Eagle made a decision. "There is a place ahead, sacred to my people, a stone arch where the cliff overhangs the river. We can shelter there, but it means leaving the ravine and crossing open ground." "Do we have a choice?" Mary asked. Swift Eagle shook his head. "No, but once we reach the arch, we will be safe. No white man has found it before." The transition from the relative protection of the ravine to the exposed ridge above was like stepping from a cold room into a freezer. The wind hit them with physical force, driving snow and ice horizontally into their faces. Visibility dropped to mere feet, forcing them to form a human chain, each woman gripping the clothing of the person ahead. Catherine lost all sense of time and direction, trusting Swift Eagle to guide them through the white void. Her fingers and toes had long since gone numb, her face a mask of ice. Each breath was agony, the frigid air burning in her lungs. Then came the howl, closer now, much closer. The dogs had caught their scent despite the storm. "Run!" Swift Eagle shouted, abandoning stealth for speed. They ran, or tried to, their exhausted legs pumping through knee-deep snow. Abigail stumbled again, and this time Swift Eagle simply swept her into his arms without breaking stride. Catherine's lungs screamed for air, her vision narrowing as dark spots danced at its edges. Just when she thought her body would simply quit, surrendering to the cold and exhaustion, the ground dropped away beneath her feet. She let out a startled cry, flailing, only to land on a hard stone surface perhaps 6 feet below where she'd been running. "The arch!" Swift Eagle said, helping her to her feet. "Quickly, inside!" A narrow passage opened in the cliff face, nearly invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. Swift Eagle ushered them through, Abigail still in his arms, the others following in stunned silence. The passage widened into a small cave, the air noticeably warmer than outside. Most surprising was the faint glow emanating from deeper within. Not firelight, but some kind of phosphorescence from the stone itself, casting the space in an ethereal blue-green light. "What is this place?" Rebecca breathed, her educator's curiosity momentarily overcoming her exhaustion. "The Weeping Stone," Swift Eagle replied, setting Abigail down gently on a relatively flat area. "Sacred to my people for many generations, the light comes from the tears of the mountain." Under different circumstances, Catherine might have pressed for a more scientific explanation, but at that moment, she was simply grateful for the shelter and the respite from the relentless cold. "Will they find us here?" Grace asked, huddling against the wall, her young face drawn with fatigue. Swift Eagle shook his head. "The entrance is hidden, and the storm will cover our tracks. The dogs cannot follow our scent through solid stone." For the first time in hours, Catherine allowed herself to hope they might survive this ordeal. Then she remembered. "But what about your people? The camp? If we're safe here, they're still in danger." "My people know these mountains better than any white man," Swift Eagle said. They began moving to the winter caves at first light. By now, they are safely hidden. Relief washed over Catherine. followed immediately by a wave of exhaustion so profound she could barely remain upright. Around her, the other women were similarly affected, slumping against the walls or simply sitting where they stood. "Rest," Swift Eagle told them. "I will keep watch." They needed no further encouragement. Within minutes, all 5 women had succumbed to exhaustion, sleep claiming them despite the hard stone floor and the lingering chill. Catherine dreamed of Edward, not as he had been in those final moments on the mountain, cold and calculating, but as he had been when they first met. The charming smile, the gentle touch, the promises of a life together. How had she not seen the falseness behind his eyes? How had she not recognized the predator beneath the mask of affection? She woke with a start, disoriented by the strange blue-green light and the unfamiliar surroundings. For a moment, panic gripped her. Then memory returned, bringing with it the full weight of their situation. The others were still sleeping, their breath forming small clouds in the cool air. Swift Eagle sat near the entrance, motionless as a statue, his eyes fixed on the narrow gap that connected them to the outside world. Catherine moved to join him, wincing as her stiff muscles protested. "How long was I asleep?" "Many hours," he replied. "The sun has set and risen again." She blinked in surprise. "A full day. Why didn't you wake us? Your bodies needed healing. The weeping stone helps." Catherine couldn't argue. Despite the discomfort of sleeping on stone, she felt more rested than she had since before Edward's betrayal. Even the persistent ache in her frostbitten extremities had diminished to a dull throb. "The hunters?" she asked. "Gone," Swift Eagle said. "The storm drove them back to your town, but they will return when the weather clears." Catherine absorbed this information, understanding its implications. Their respite was temporary. Soon, Edward would lead another hunting party into the mountains, perhaps with more men, more dogs. The cycle would continue until he found what he sought, whether it was her, the Cheyenne, or both. "We can't keep running," she said, the realization solidifying in her mind. "Sooner or later he'll find us, or your people." Swift Eagle studied her face. "What do you suggest?" The question hung between them, heavy with potential. Catherine had been turning possibilities over in her mind since she first saw Edward leading the hunting party. Now, in the strange light of the weeping stone, a plan began to take shape. "We need to stop him," she said finally. "Not just hide from him, stop him." Swift Eagle raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "Edward believes I'm dead. That gives us an advantage. He doesn't know we're aware of his hunting parties or that I've been helping your people. He doesn't know about my connection to the other women." Catherine's mind raced ahead, seeing the pieces fall into place. What if we used that? What if we made him believe he was being haunted by the women he thought he'd disposed of? The corner of Swift Eagle's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "A ghost story?" "More than that," Catherine said, warming to the idea. "Edward is superstitious. Most men in Pinecrest are. They attend Reverend Hughes's sermons about divine punishment and eternal damnation. What if we made Edward believe that his crimes had awakened something supernatural? Something that wouldn't. Rest until justice was done." Swift Eagle considered this. "My people have stories of spirits who walk between worlds to right great wrongs. The white settlers have similar tales, yes?" "They do," Catherine confirmed. "And men like Edward, men who present themselves as rational and superior while harboring deep superstitions. They're the most vulnerable to such fears. If we could make him believe he was being pursued by something beyond his understanding, he might confess," Swift Eagle finished, "or flee." "Either would serve our purpose," Catherine said. "But we'd need help from your people and from the women." Their conversation was interrupted by Abigail's voice, rough with sleep but alert. "Count me in for any plan that puts the fear of God into Edward Wilson," she said, pushing herself to a sitting position. "I've mixed herbs that can make a man see his deepest fears. Used them once on a wife-beater in Ohio. He never raised his hand again." Mary stirred next, then Rebecca and Grace. Soon all 5 women were awake, listening as Catherine outlined her emerging plan. "It's risky," Rebecca cautioned when Catherine finished. "If Edward realizes what we're doing, he'll kill us all without hesitation. And even if he doesn't, we'd be revealing ourselves to Pinecrest. We might never be able to live normal lives again." "Normal?" Grace scoffed. "What's normal about being thrown away to die? What's normal about hiding in caves while men like Edward profit from our suffering?" Mary placed a calming hand on Grace's arm. "She's right to be cautious. We need to think this through carefully. But," she added, a hard glint in her eye, "I'm tired of running. If there's a chance to make Edward pay for what he did to Kat, what all those men did to us, I want to take it." Swift Eagle had remained silent throughout their discussion, his expression unreadable. Now he spoke, his voice contemplative. "There is a Cheyenne saying, 'A cornered mouse will bite the cat.' You women are not mice, but you have been cornered. Perhaps it is time to show your teeth. We'll need more than teeth," Abigail muttered. "We'll need a miracle." Catherine looked around at the faces of these women who had endured so much, who had been discarded and forgotten, yet refused to disappear. "Not a miracle," she said quietly. "Just justice, and maybe a little theater." The plan took shape. Over the following days, refined through hours of discussion as they remained hidden in the sanctuary of the Weeping Stone. Swift Eagle came and went, bringing food and news from the Cheyenne camp, which had indeed relocated safely to a network of caves deeper in the mountains. On his 3rd day of scouting, he returned with Morning Star, who listened to their plan with thoughtful intensity before offering her own insights. "The men of your town fear our ways," she observed. "They call it witchcraft, devil worship. We can use this fear." Morning Star's contribution proved invaluable. As a healer, she knew which herbs could induce disorientation, which could cause vivid dreams, which could be burned to create smoke that stung the eyes and blurred vision. Combined with Abigail's knowledge of folk remedies, they created a potent arsenal of natural substances, designed not to harm, but to unsettle and confuse. Rebecca, drawing on her education, contributed historical accounts of hauntings that had driven men to confession or madness. Mary, pragmatic as always, focused on logistics, how to move undetected, where to stage their interventions, how to escape if things went wrong. Grace, with the boundless energy of youth, volunteered for the most physically demanding roles, and Catherine, who knew Edward better than anyone, mapped his habits, his weaknesses, the chinks in his psychological armor. She remembered his irrational fear of his mother's ghost, his secret consultation with a fortune teller in Silverton, his tendency to drink heavily when troubled. "He'll be vulnerable after dark," she told the others, "especially if he's been drinking, and he always drinks more when he's worried about something." "So we give him something to worry about," Grace said, her young face alight with vengeful anticipation. The first stage of their plan was simple reconnaissance. Swift Eagle, virtually invisible when he chose to be, observed Edward's movements for several days, confirming Catherine's recollections and adding new details. "He drinks at the saloon until sunset," Swift Eagle reported, "then returns to your cabin alone. He has nightmares, talks in his sleep, calls your name sometimes." "Good," Catherine said, though the thought of Edward sleeping in the bed they had shared made her stomach churn. "Guilt is already working on him. We'll accelerate it." Next came preparation. Morning Star and Swift Eagle guided them to hidden, path that would allow them to approach Pinecrest, and specifically the Wilson cabin, without being seen. Abigail and Morningstar worked together, preparing their herbal concoctions. Rebecca drafted messages that would play on Edward's specific fears, while Mary fashioned crude masks from birch bark, painting them with symbols that combined Christian imagery of judgment with Cheyenne spiritual motifs. The weather cooperated, the severe storm giving way to clear, cold nights with a waning moon. Enough light to see by, but plenty of shadows to hide within. The frozen ground held their footprints to a minimum, and the bare trees provided less. Cover for Edward's hunting dogs. 7 days after their escape from the cave, they were ready. The night was perfect, cold and still, with just enough cloud cover to occasionally obscure the moon. Edward had been to the saloon as usual, according to Swift Eagle's reconnaissance, and had drunk more heavily than normal. "Remember," Catherine said as they gathered at the edge of the woods behind the Wilson cabin, "we don't want to harm him. Just frighten him into confession. If anything goes wrong, we retreat immediately to the meeting point." They had all donned the strange masks Mary had created, their clothing augmented with bits of fur, feathers and bone to create unsettling silhouettes. Abigail had prepared a mixture of herbs that, when burned, created a thick, acrid smoke that would sting the eyes and blur vision. Morningstar had contributed a powder that, when thrown into a fire, would cause it to flare with an unnatural blue-green flame reminiscent of the weeping stone's phosphorescence. Swift Eagle would remain at the edge of the clearing, bow ready, not to kill, but to create distractions if needed. The women would approach the cabin from different directions, surrounding it before beginning their performance. As Catherine took her position, watching the faint light flickering through the cabin's single window, a wave of doubt washed over her. Was this justice, or was it revenge? Was she becoming as cruel as Edward in her quest to punish him? Then, she remembered the moment he had left her in the snow, the casual way he had discarded her life for a piece of land. She thought of Mary, thrown out for refusing a man's advances, of Rebecca, ostracized for questioning authority, of Grace, punished for defending what was rightfully hers, of Abigail, condemned for using knowledge rather than submitting to a doctor's dubious remedies. No, this wasn't revenge, this was reckoning. Catherine raised her hand, giving the signal. One by one, the women lit the small bundles of herbs Abigail had prepared, the smoke wreathing their masked figures in ghostly tendrils as they emerged from the tree line. Inside the cabin, Edward Wilson sat alone at the rough-hewn table, a bottle of whiskey half empty before him. He had not been sleeping. Well, since returning from the failed hunting expedition. Dreams haunted him, Catherine's face as he rode away, other women's voices accusing him of crimes he preferred not to remember. The first indication that something was wrong came when the fire in the hearth suddenly flared, the flames leaping unnaturally high, before turning a sickly blue-green color. Edward jerked upright, the whiskey sloshing in his glass. "What the hell?" he muttered, rising unsteadily to his feet. Then came the sound. A low, keening wail that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was Mary, using a technique Swift Eagle had taught her to throw her voice across the clearing. The eerie sound raised goosebumps on Catherine's arms, even though she knew its source. Edward moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Catherine knew the exact moment he spotted the first of them. Grace, standing motionless at the edge of the clearing, the smoke swirling around her masked figure, making her appear to hover above the ground. "No," Edward whispered, audible, through the thin glass. "No, it can't be." Rebecca was next to reveal herself, stepping into a shaft of moonlight on the opposite side of the clearing, raising her arms in accusation. Then Mary, then Abigail, each appearing like an apparition from the darkness. Catherine remained hidden, watching as Edward's face drained of color. He rubbed his eyes, clearly believing the whiskey had induced hallucinations. When the figures remained, he stumbled back from the window, knocking over his chair in his haste. Now it was Catherine's turn. She positioned herself directly in front of the cabin's door, waiting until Edward, driven by terror or courage, or some combination of both, flung it open, a rifle clutched in his shaking hands. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice breaking. "I'll shoot!" The smoke parted as Catherine stepped forward, lifting her mask just enough that Edward could glimpse her face in the moonlight. His eyes widened, the rifle barrel dipping toward the ground as shock overcame him. "Cat?" he whispered. "No. You're dead. You died on the mountain." "Did I?" Catherine asked, her voice carrying in the still night air. "Or did you merely wish me dead, Edward, just as you wished all these others dead?" She gestured to the masked figures surrounding the clearing. Edward's gaze darted between them, panic rising in his eyes. "What do you want?" he demanded, trying to sound authoritative, but failing as his voice cracked. "Confession," Catherine replied. "Truth. Justice." Edward's laugh was brittle, edged with hysteria. "You're not real. None of you are real. You're just whiskey dreams." "Are we?" Rebecca stepped forward, her voice altered by the mask she wore. "Then why do you tremble, Edward Wilson? Why does your hand shake on that rifle? Why do you wake screaming from dreams of snow and ice?" Mary added, moving closer from another direction. "Why do you drink to forget the women you've wronged?" Grace circled around behind him, making him whirl to keep her in sight. "The land you stole will turn to poison in your hands," Abigail intoned, her age-roughened voice perfect for delivering this final pronouncement. "Unless you confess your crimes and make amends." Edward backed toward the cabin door, his face ashen. "You're not real," he repeated, but with less conviction. "You can't be real." Catherine raised her hand, and Morning Star, hidden in the trees through the powder Swift Eagle had provided into a small fire they'd prepared. The clearing erupted in ghostly light as all the small fires flared simultaneously with unnatural color. At that moment, Swift Eagle loosed an arrow that struck the ground at Edward's feet, making him jump back with a strangled cry. "Your time has run out, Edward," Catherine said, advancing on him. "Confess what you did to me. Confess what you did to all of us." The combined effect, the masks, the smoke, the unnatural fires, the arrow, and most of all, the sight of his supposedly dead wife, proved too much for Edward's alcohol-addled mind. He dropped to his knees, the rifle falling forgotten beside him. "I left her," he gasped, eyes wild with terror. "I left Cat on Black Ridge to die. I wanted her father's land. The deed was in our marriage contract. Once it was mine legally, I didn't need her anymore." "And the others?" Catherine prompted. "What others?" Edward's confusion seemed genuine. Catherine hesitated. Perhaps she had been wrong about Edward having harmed other women before her. But then Abigail stepped forward. "The widow Collins," she said. "3 winters ago. She rejected you, then disappeared. The town believed she returned east." Edward's face contorted. "That was different. She threatened to tell people about certain transactions, business matters. She had to go." "And Sarah Jenkins?" Rebecca pressed. "The seamstress who vanished last spring." Edward's eyes darted between the masked figures, increasingly frantic. "How do you know these things? No one knew about Sarah. No one." "The dead know everything, Edward," Catherine said, her blood running cold at the confirmation that her husband was indeed a multiple murderer. "Your crimes cry out for justice." Something in Edward snapped. He lunged for the rifle, bringing it up with surprising speed, given his inebriated state. "Get back!" he screamed. "Get back or I'll send you all to hell for real this time." Swift Eagle's second arrow knocked the rifle from Edward's grasp before he could fire, the weapon discharging harmlessly into the air as it fell. Edward clutched his hand, howling in pain and terror. "What do you want from me?" he sobbed, all pretense of strength gone. "Write it down," Catherine commanded, tossing a sheet of paper and a pencil that landed at his feet. "All of it. Every woman you've harmed, every crime you've committed. Sign your name to your confession." "And if I don't?" Edward asked, a hint of his usual defiance returning. "Then we will haunt you until madness claims you," Catherine promised. "Every night, every waking moment, we will be there, watching, waiting, reminding you of what you've done. Your land will yield no crops, your sleep will bring no rest, your days will be filled with dread, and your nights with terror." Edward stared at her, his face a battlefield of emotions: fear, hatred, disbelief, and finally resignation. Slowly, he picked up the paper and pencil. "Write," Catherine repeated, and Edward wrote, his hand shaking so badly the letters were barely legible, but the message clear enough. Names, dates, methods, a litany of cruelty that made Catherine sick to read over his shoulder. When he finished, he signed his name with a flourish that seemed grotesquely out of place, given the contents. "Now what?" he asked, dropping the pencil. "You kill me? Is that what this is about?" "No," Catherine said, taking the confession and folding it carefully. "We are not like you, Edward. We do not dispose of people when they become inconvenient. This confession goes to Sheriff Tate in the morning. What happens after that is between you and the law." Edward laughed bitterly. "Tate? He won't care. He's known about half of this for years, turned a blind eye for a cut of my profits." Catherine hadn't expected this revelation, though perhaps she should have. Corruption in Pinecrest ran deeper than she had imagined. "Then it goes to Fort Anderson," she amended, "to the federal marshal there, along with testimonies from all of us. The women you thought were dead and gone." Fear flickered in Edward's eyes again. The federal marshals were a different matter than the local sheriff. They had no stake in Pinecrest's corrupt arrangements. "You can run," Catherine continued. "Try to disappear before the marshal arrives. But then you'll be the one hunted, Edward. How does it feel?" She stepped back, gesturing for the others to do the same. Their part was done. Edward had confessed. Now they needed to deliver that confession before he could recant or flee. But Edward, humiliated and cornered, made one last desperate move. As Catherine turned to leave, he produced a small derringer from his boot, a backup weapon she hadn't known he possessed. The click of the hammer was unmistakable in the sudden silence. "You think you've won," he snarled. "But dead women tell. No tales, Cat. And this time, I'll make sure you stay dead." Before he could fire, an arrow struck him in the shoulder, the impact spinning him around. The derringer discharged harmlessly into the ground. Swift Eagle emerged from the shadows, already knocking another arrow. "No!" Catherine cried, stopping him before he could loose it. "He's not worth hanging for." Edward crumpled to the ground, clutching his wounded shoulder, all fight gone from him. "You're really alive," he whimpered, looking up at Catherine, with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "How? No one could have survived that mountain." "I had help," Catherine said simply, "something you wouldn't understand." She collected the derringer, tucking it into her own belt. "Bind his wound," she told the others, "then tie him securely. We'll take him with us to Fort Anderson. Let him face justice properly." As Mary and Rebecca moved to comply, using strips, torn from Edward's own bedding to bind first his wound and then his hands, Catherine stepped away, suddenly exhausted by the confrontation. The plan had worked, but not without revealing how much deeper Edward's depravity ran than she had imagined. Swift Eagle joined her at the edge of the clearing. "You have your justice," he observed. "Not yet," Catherine replied, watching as the women secured Edward. "But soon." She thought of the names on Edward's confession, women who would never see justice done, families who might never know what had happened to their daughters, sisters, wives. The victory felt hollow in the face of so much suffering. "You could not save them," Swift Eagle said, seeming to read her thoughts, "but you have stopped him from harming others. That is something." Catherine nodded, accepting the truth in his words. It wasn't a perfect justice, but it was something. A beginning. As they prepared to transport Edward to Fort Anderson, Catherine took one last look at the cabin that had been her home. The place where she had once believed herself loved, where she had envisioned a future. Now it stood as a monument to deception and betrayal. She would not miss it. Whatever came next, whether the federal marshal believed their story, whether Edward faced proper punishment, whether she and the other women could build new lives, it would be of their own choosing. They had survived being discarded. They had refused to disappear. They had reclaimed their voices and their power. And in that, the journey to Fort Anderson stretched across 3 grueling days. Edward's wound, though not life-threatening, slowed their progress considerably. He alternated between feverish delirium and sullen silence, occasionally attempting to reason with Catherine when the others were out of earshot. "We could start over, Cat," he murmured on the second night as she changed his bandage. "Somewhere new, California maybe. The gold rush isn't over yet." Catherine merely tightened the bandage with more force than necessary, making him wince. "The only rush in your future is to the gallows, Edward." His face darkened. "You think those self-righteous lawmen at the fort will believe a group of outcast women over a respected landowner? Your word against mine?" "Not just our word," Catherine reminded him, patting the pocket where his signed confession remained. "Your own hand condemns you." Edward's eyes narrowed. "A confession signed under duress, while I was half out of my mind with whiskey and fear. No court would accept it." For the first time, doubt crept into Catherine's resolve. Edward wasn't a wrong. A clever lawyer might indeed convince a judge that the confession had been coerced. Without bodies or witnesses to the other murders, the case against him would rest largely on the testimony of women who had been cast out of proper society, one of whom was supposed to be dead. Swift Eagle, overhearing this exchange from his position by the fire, approached silently. "The white man's justice is different from ours," he observed. "But not all white men are blind. Some see truth when it stands before them." Catherine wanted to believe him, but Edward's smug expression eroded her confidence. What if this journey ended not with justice, but with their own imprisonment for kidnapping and assault? What if Edward walked free, now knowing that she was alive and determined to expose him? Grace, who'd been keeping watch nearby, joined the conversation. "We don't need courts," she said, her young voice hard with conviction. "We know the truth. The women of Pinecrest deserve to know what kind of monster lived among them, whether or not a judge says he's guilty." That night, Catherine slept fitfully, plagued by dreams of Edward walking free while she languished behind bars. By dawn, she had reached a decision. Gathering the women and Swift Eagle while Edward still slept, bound to a tree, she outlined her concerns. "We can't rely solely on the federal marshal," she concluded. "We need a contingency plan." Rebecca, ever the practical one, suggested they split into 2 groups. "Mary Abigail and I will continue to Fort Anderson with Edward and the confession. Cat, you and Grace should return to Pinecrest with Swift Eagle. Spread the word among the women. There. Make sure that even if Edward somehow escapes legal justice, he can never again hide behind respectability." "Divide our strength?" Mary questioned. "Is that wise?" "It divides Edward's attention too," Rebecca pointed out. "He can't focus on discrediting all of us at once." The logic was sound, though Catherine hated the thought of separating. These women had become her sisters in adversity. but the cause of justice mattered more than her personal comfort. By mid-morning they had reached a fork in the trail. One path continued northeast toward Fort Anderson, the other curved back toward Pinecrest Valley. The moment of parting was surprisingly emotional. These women who had endured so much together, embraced with tears and whispered promises. "If he walks free," Catherine told Rebecca, clasping her hands tightly, "bring the others to Eagle Feather Camp. We'll regroup there." "And if the marshal believes us?" Rebecca asked. "Then come to Pinecrest," Catherine replied. "We'll celebrate together." Mary, practical as ever, had the final word. "Either way, we've already won. We survived. We're free. Edward is the one in chains now." With Edward secured to a travois pulled by the horse Swift Eagle had brought, Rebecca, Mary, and Abigail continued toward Fort Anderson. Catherine watched them grow smaller in the distance, willing them strength for the journey ahead. "Come," Swift Eagle said gently. "We have our own path to walk." The route back to Pinecrest took them past the cave where the women had sheltered. For months, it stood empty now, a testament to resilience and survival against all odds. Catherine paused at the entrance, remembering the fierce determination that had kept these women alive when Pinecrest had discarded them like unwanted refuse. "We should stop for supplies," Grace suggested, nodding toward the cave. "There's still food, blankets, tools." Catherine shook her head. "Leave it. Someone else might need this sanctuary someday." They reached the outskirts of Pinecrest as dusk settled over the valley. Lights glowed in windows, smoke curled from chimneys, and the distant sound of piano music drifted from the saloon. It looked peaceful, ordinary, a stark contrast to the darkness Catherine now knew lurked beneath its respectable facade. Swift Eagle halted at the edge of the forest. "I cannot go further," he said. "My presence would only bring danger." Catherine understood. A Cheyenne man walking openly into a frontier town was asking for violence, especially given the hunting parties Edward had organized. "We'll meet you back here tomorrow," she promised. "Be careful." Swift Eagle touched his fingers to his heart, then to his forehead, a gesture of respect Catherine had learned during her time with the Cheyenne. Then he melted into the darkening forest, invisible as a shadow. Catherine turned to Grace. "Ready?" The younger woman squared her shoulders. "As I'll ever be." They had discussed their approach carefully. Walking openly into town risked immediate detection. Instead, they would move under cover of darkness to the home of Sarah Jenkins's sister, Martha. If anyone would be receptive to the truth about Edward Wilson, it would be a woman whose sister had mysteriously disappeared. Martha Jenkins lived on the eastern edge of town, in a small house attached to her dressmaking shop. A widow herself, she had taken in her sister Sarah after Sarah's husband died of consumption, according to town gossip, which Grace had absorbed. During her brief time in Pinecrest, Martha had never accepted the story that Sarah had simply abandoned her and returned east. The two women approached the rear of the house cautiously. A single lamp burned in the back room, Martha's sewing room, where she often worked late into the evening on special commissions. Catherine hesitated at the door, suddenly uncertain. What if Martha turned them away? What if she summoned Sheriff Tate immediately? They were risking everything on the hope that blood ties would prove stronger than community pressure. Grace squeezed her arm reassuringly. "We have to try." Catherine nodded and knocked softly on the door. Footsteps approached, and the door opened a crack, revealing a sliver of Martha Jenkins' face, lined with exhaustion and wariness. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice low but firm. "Someone who knows what happened to Sarah," Catherine replied, quietly. The door opened wider, Martha's eyes widening as she took in the two women standing on her doorstep, one she had never seen before, and one who was supposed to be dead. "Catherine Wilson?" she gasped. "But you're not dead." Catherine finished for her. "May we come in? It's not safe for us to be seen." Martha hesitated only briefly before stepping back, allowing them entry. Once inside, she secured the door with trembling hands. "Edward said you'd run off with a trapper," she said, studying Catherine's face as if searching for confirmation of a long-held suspicion. "Edward says many things," Catherine replied, "none of them true." Martha's expression hardened. "He said the same about Sarah, that she'd grown restless and headed back east without saying goodbye." She shook her head. "Sarah would never have left without a word, never." "She didn't," Grace said softly. "Edward made her disappear, just like he tried to do with Kat, and with me, and with others." Martha sank into a chair, her face ashen. "How do you know this?" Catherine drew Edward's confession from her pocket, unfolding it carefully. "Because he admitted it," she said, placing the paper in Martha's hands. The dressmaker read silently. One hand pressed to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. When she finished, she looked up at Catherine with a mixture of grief and rage. "Where is he now?" she demanded. "Where is the monster who killed my sister?" "On his way to Fort Anderson," Catherine explained, "along with 3 other women he tried to dispose of. We're hoping the federal marshal there will ensure justice is served." "And if he doesn't?" Catherine met her gaze steadily. "Then we'll serve it ourselves. That's why we've come to you, Martha. We need your help to spread the truth among the women of Pinecrest. Every wife, sister, daughter needs to know what kind of man Edward Wilson truly is, and what kind of men protected him." Martha's face hardened with resolve. "There are others who never believed the convenient stories. Judith Miller never accepted that her daughter chose to abandon her children. Margaret Hayes questioned how her sister could drown in a foot of water." She stood, suddenly energized by purpose. "I can arrange a meeting. Tomorrow night. My sewing. A circle. 12 women who trust each other implicitly." Catherine nodded, relief washing over her. "Thank you." Martha offered them shelter for the night, a risk, but one she seemed willing to take. As they settled into the small guest room that had once been Sarah's, Grace voiced a concern that had been growing since they parted from the others. What if Edward convinces the marshal that Rebecca and the others kidnapped him? What if they're arrested instead of him? Catherine had been wrestling with the same worry. "We have to trust that the truth will be convincing enough," she said, though her voice lacked certainty. "The truth?" Grace scoffed. "When has that ever been enough against a man with money and connections?" Catherine had no answer. Instead, she reached out and squeezed Grace's hand. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we fight our way." The sewing circle gathered the following evening under the guise of planning the spring festival decorations. 12 women, ranging in age from barely 20 to well past 60, crowded into Martha's back room, sewing baskets in hand as cover for their real purpose. Catherine and Grace remained hidden in Sarah's former bedroom until Martha had explained the situation and gauged the women's reactions. Then, with a nod from their hostess, they emerged to face a room full of stunned expressions. "Catherine Wilson," Judith Miller breathed. "We thought you were dead." "Edward certainly hoped so," Catherine replied, settling onto a chair. Martha had positioned at the head of the room, just as he hoped the same for Sarah Jenkins and Dorothy Collins and at least 5 other women who crossed his path over the years. For the next hour, Catherine and Grace shared their stories. Edward's calculated abandonment of Catherine in the mountains, the other women's various exiles, their survival against all odds, and finally, their confrontation with Edward and his subsequent confession. "We have the signed document," Catherine explained, passing Edward's confession around the circle, "but we fear it may not be enough for the federal authorities, especially if Sheriff Tate intervenes on Edward's behalf." The mention of Tate caused a ripple of knowing glances around the room. Margaret Hayes, a stern-faced woman in her 50s, voiced what many clearly thought. "Tate has protected more than just Edward over the years," she said grimly. My Henry questioned a land deal Tate facilitated last summer. 3 days later, he was found beaten half to death behind the saloon. No culprits identified, of course. The pattern became clearer as more women spoke. A systematic silencing of anyone who challenged the authority of Pinecrest's male power structure. Women who asked too many questions conveniently disappeared or were labeled hysterical. Men who refused to participate in corrupt dealings suffered accidents or found themselves accused of crimes they didn't commit. It's not just Edward, realized Catherine, the full scope of Pinecrest's corruption finally becoming clear. It's an entire system designed to maintain power for a select few men. "And what do you propose we do about it?" asked Eleanor Pierce, at 65, the oldest woman present. "We're women in a frontier town with no legal rights to speak of. We can't vote, can't serve on juries, can't even own property in our own names, in most cases." Catherine leaned forward, her voice low, but intense. "That's precisely why they've gotten away with it for so long. They believe we're powerless, but there are more of us than there are of them, and we have something they lack, the truth and the determination to share it." Grace joined in, her youthful earnestness compelling. "We survived when they tried. To erase us, that's a power they didn't count on." By midnight, a plan had formed. The women would spread the truth about Edward Wilson throughout Pinecrest, not in public accusations that could be dismissed as women's hysteria, but through the quiet, intimate conversations that formed the real social fabric of the community. Kitchens, laundry lines, church socials, spaces where women gathered and spoke freely among themselves. They would gather evidence of other crimes committed or covered up by Sheriff Tate and his associates. Meanwhile, Catherine and Grace would remain hidden, moving between safe houses established by the Sewing Circle members. If Edward somehow evaded justice at Fort Anderson and returned to Pinecrest, he would find not a haven, but a community prepared to hold him accountable. 4 days passed, a period of tense waiting and careful preparation. Catherine relocated each night, never staying more than 24 hours in any one household. The women of the Sewing Circle provided updates on the town's reaction to the spreading rumors about Edward Wilson. Reverend Hughes gave a sermon yesterday about bearing false witness, reported Judith Miller. Didn't mention Edward by name, but everyone knew who he meant. Sheriff Tate has been asking questions about strangers in town, added Margaret Hayes, particularly women. He suspects something, but doesn't know what. On the 5th day, Martha burst into Eleanor Pierce's home, where Catherine was currently sheltering, with momentous news. "A telegram arrived from Fort Anderson," she announced breathlessly. "Edward Wilson is to stand trial for the murder of Sarah and at least 2 other women. They found remains on his property." Catherine sank into a chair, relief washing over her. "So the marshal believed Rebecca and the others?" Martha nodded. "Not just believed. According to the telegram, he's arrested Sheriff Tate as an accessory after the fact. Apparently, Edward implicated him in exchange for avoiding the gallows." The realization that justice might actually prevail was almost overwhelming. After so long fighting simply to survive, the prospect of true accountability seemed almost foreign. "What about the others?" Grace asked. "Rebecca, Mary, Abigail?" "The telegram didn't say," Martha admitted, "but a military escort is bringing Edward back to Pinecrest for a preliminary hearing before his transfer to the territorial capital for trial. They should arrive within 2 days." The news spread rapidly through the network of women Catherine had helped establish. By nightfall, the whole town was abuzz with speculation and shock. Men who had gladly joined Edward's hunting parties or shared drinks with him at the saloon now loudly proclaimed they had always found something not quite right about him. Catherine observed this hypocrisy from the shadows, disgusted but unsurprised. When power shifted, allegiances followed. But she took satisfaction in knowing that the women of Pinecrest would never again be quite so trusting of the men who claimed to protect them. That evening, she slipped away to the forest edge where Swift Eagle waited. He had maintained his vigil faithfully, bringing news from the Cheyenne camp and ensuring Catherine and Grace always had an escape route if needed. "Edward returns in chains," she told him, "and the sheriff with him." Swift Eagle's expression remained impassive, but satisfaction flickered in his eyes. "Good, but do not trust that this ends the danger. One snake may die, but the nest remains." Catherine understood his caution. Edward and Tate were symptoms of a deeper corruption, not its cause. Real change would require more than the removal of two men, no matter how influential. "I want to bring Grace to your camp tonight," she said. "It's not safe for her here once the military escort arrives. Too many questions about her supposed disappearance." Swift Eagle nodded. "She will be welcome. And you?" Catherine hesitated. Part of her longed for the peace of Eagle Feather Camp, away from Pinecrest's painful memories and lingering dangers. But another part felt obligated to see this through to the end, to witness Edward's public humiliation and ensure the full truth emerged. "I'll stay until after the hearing," she decided, "then join you." The military escort arrived at noon. The following day, 6 uniformed soldiers on horseback surrounding a wagon containing the shackled forms of Edward Wilson and Sheriff Tate. Behind them rode Rebecca, Mary, and Abigail, accompanied by a distinguished-looking man Catherine presumed to be the federal marshal. The town gathered in the street to witness this extraordinary spectacle. Whispers rippled through the crowd as people recognized the women who had supposedly disappeared or died. Edward, his shoulder still bandaged from Swift Eagle's arrow, kept his gaze fixed on the ground, refusing to meet the accusatory stares of his former neighbors. Catherine remained hidden, watching from the narrow gap between two buildings. Although the temptation to reveal herself was strong, she resisted. Her time would come, but not yet. The preliminary hearing was held in the town hall, the largest building in Pinecrest. Marshal James Harrington presided, a stern-faced man with a reputation for incorruptibility. The proceedings were open to the public, and the hall quickly filled beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and crowding the doorways. Rebecca, Mary, and Abigail testified first, each telling their story of abandonment and survival. Then came Martha Jenkins, speaking for her murdered sister Sarah. One by one, other women stepped forward. Relatives of Edward's victims, witnesses to Sheriff Tate's corruption, victims of the system that had protected such men for years. Edward's confession was entered into evidence, though his attorney, hastily summoned from Silverton, argued strenuously that it had been obtained under duress. Marshal Harrington overruled these objections, citing the physical evidence found on Edward's property that corroborated the document's claims. Sheriff Tate, sensing the changing winds, attempted to save himself by offering further testimony against Edward and implicating several other prominent men in Pinecrest's corrupted power structure. His desperation was palpable as he named names, dates, and specific instances of bribery, evidence tampering, and witness intimidation. The hearing stretched into the evening, the kerosene lamps casting long shadows across faces twisted with shock, anger, and in some cases fear. More than one man slipped quietly from the hall as Tate's accusations touched too close to home. Finally, as the proceedings drew to a close, Marshal Harrington addressed the crowded room. "Based on the testimony heard today and the physical evidence recovered, I am remanding Edward Wilson to territorial custody to stand trial for the murders of Sarah Jenkins, Dorothy Collins, and Elizabeth Fremont." Sheriff Thomas Tate will also be held on charges of accessory after the fact, evidence tampering, and corruption of office. A murmur ran through the crowd, a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief that men of such standing could fall so far, so fast. The marshal continued. Additionally, warrants will be issued for the arrest of Reverend Samuel Hughes, Dr. William Thompson, and Mayor Frederick Palmer on various charges stemming from Sheriff Tate's testimony. This announcement caused a genuine uproar. The mayor himself, seated in the front row, leapt to his feet in protest, only to be immediately restrained by two soldiers. In the chaos that followed, Catherine slipped away, her mind reeling from what she had witnessed. The pillars of Pinecrest society, men who had cast out women, silenced dissent, and maintained their power through intimidation and violence, were toppling like dominoes. She made her way to the forest edge, where Swift Eagle waited with grace. "It's done," she told them. "Edward and Tate are being taken to the territorial capital for trial. The mayor, the reverend, and the doctor are being arrested as conspirators." Grace's eyes widened. "All of them? I never thought." "Nor did they," Catherine said, a grim satisfaction in her voice. "That was their mistake, believing they were untouchable." Swift Eagle studied her face. "You seem troubled by this victory." Catherine sighed, the weight of the past weeks suddenly pressing down on her. "Justice is being served, but at what cost? So many women lost their lives before anyone listened. So many families destroyed." "The cost of change is always high," Swift Eagle observed, "but not as high as the cost of remaining silent." As they prepared to depart for Eagle Feather Camp, Rebecca, Mary, and Abigail emerged from the shadows, having followed Catherine from town. "There you are," Rebecca said, embracing Catherine tightly. "We've been looking everywhere." Reunited at last, the five women shared their experiences since parting ways, the journey to Fort Anderson, the discovery of the bodies on Edward's property, the marshal's immediate action upon realizing the extent of the crimes. "What happens now?" Grace asked as they walked toward the Cheyenne camp, guided by Swift Eagle through the darkening forest. "The marshal has offered us witness protection," Mary explained. "Government stipends and relocation to Denver, or even further east if we prefer." "And is that what you want?" Catherine asked. "To start over somewhere else?" The women exchanged glances, a wordless communication born of shared hardship. "I don't know," Rebecca admitted. "Part of me wants to put this all behind me, but another part wants to stay and help rebuild." Abigail finished for her. "To ensure that what happened to us doesn't happen to others." Catherine understood completely. The same conflict had been raging within her since Edward's arrest. Was it better to leave the painful past behind, or to remain and transform it into something better? As they approached Eagle Feather Camp, the glow of fires visible through the trees, Catherine felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since before Edward's betrayal. Here, among these women who had survived the unsurvivable, and the Cheyenne who had shown more humanity than her own people, she had found something precious. Not just survival, but belonging. Morning Star greeted them at the edge of camp, embracing each woman in turn. "You have returned," she said, genuine warmth in her voice. "All of you." "For now," Catherine replied. "Beyond that, we're still deciding." The healer nodded wisely. "Some decisions cannot be rushed. They must rise from the heart like water from a spring, in their own time, in their own way." That night, gathered around the central fire of Eagle Feather Camp, Catherine watched the faces of her companions illuminated by the dancing flames. These women had been through hell together, had faced death and emerged stronger. Whatever paths they chose next, that bond would remain unbroken. Rebecca sat deep in conversation with a Cheyenne elder, her educator's curiosity evident in her attentive expression. Mary helped with the evening meal preparation, her practical skills transcending cultural differences. Abigail compared healing herbs with Morning Star, two women of wisdom finding common ground. Grace played with the Cheyenne children, her youth, allowing her to bridge language barriers through the universal medium of games. Swift Eagle settled beside Catherine, following her gaze around the circle. "They heal," he observed. "We all do," Catherine replied, slowly but surely. "And you, what path calls to your heart?" Catherine considered the question that had been haunting her since Edward's capture. "I don't know yet. Part of me wants to stay in Pinecrest to help rebuild it into something better. Another part never wants to see that place again." Swift Eagle nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The wounded deer fears the meadow where the arrow struck, even after the wound heals. But if the deer avoids all meadows forever, the hunter wins," Catherine countered. A smile touched Swift Eagle's lips. "You begin to think like Cheyenne." The conversation might have continued, but at that moment, a commotion arose at the edge of camp. Two Cheyenne scouts hurried toward the chief's lodge, their expressions urgent. Swift Eagle rose immediately, moving to intercept them. Catherine watched the subsequent discussion with growing concern, though she couldn't understand the rapid Cheyenne speech. When Swift Eagle returned, his face was grave. "What is it?" she asked. "The blue coats, soldiers are coming. Many of them. They ride from Fort Anderson toward Pinecrest, but their path will take them near our camp." Catherine's heart pounded as Swift Eagle's words registered. Soldiers approaching meant danger, not just for the Cheyenne who had saved her life, but potentially for the women as well. If the military discovered them living among the Cheyenne, it could undermine their testimony against Edward and the others. "How many soldiers?" she asked, already calculating possibilities in her mind. 20, perhaps 30, Swift Eagle replied grimly. "A full patrol, not just messengers." Rebecca joined them, sensing the tension. "What's happening?" Catherine quickly explained the situation. Rebecca's face paled, but her voice remained steady. Could it be related to Edward's case? Perhaps they're searching for more evidence. "Or for us," Mary suggested, approaching with Abigail and Grace. "Marshal Harrington might have sent them looking when we disappeared after the hearing." Swift Eagle shook his head. "These soldiers come from the north, not from Fort Anderson. Different unit." The Cheyenne camp had erupted into controlled chaos. Women packed essential supplies while men gathered weapons. Not to fight, Catherine realized, but to protect their retreat if necessary. Children were quieted, horses readied. This was clearly a well-rehearsed response to an all-too-familiar threat. "You should go with them," Catherine told Swift Eagle. "Your people need you." "And you?" he asked, studying her intently. "If the soldiers find you here." Catherine hadn't considered her own safety. To be discovered living with the Cheyenne might raise questions about her credibility as a witness against Edward, but to flee now felt like abandonment of the people who had saved her. "We need to find out why they're coming," she decided. "If it's related to Edward's case, we should speak with them. If it's something else..." Chief Greywolf approached, his weathered face solemn. Though he spoke little English, he had authorized Catherine's stay in the camp and treated her with distant respect. Now he addressed Swift Eagle in rapid Cheyenne, occasionally gesturing toward the women. "He says you cannot stay," Swift Eagle translated. "Not for your safety, but for ours. If soldiers find white women in our camp, they will assume captivity. Not alliance, it would give them reason to attack." The chief's logic was irrefutable. Catherine nodded her understanding. "Tell him we'll go, but we won't betray your location." As Swift Eagle translated, Greywolf studied Catherine intently, weighing her sincerity. After a moment, he spoke again. "He says Morning Star will guide you to a settler's cabin 2 miles east. The family there trades fairly with the Cheyenne. They will shelter you until danger passes." Swift Eagle paused, then added, He also says that a debt repaid is a bond formed. You owe us nothing now, but the bond remains. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes at this formal acknowledgement of their shared humanity. Tell him I don't measure friendship by debts. A rare smile touched Grey Wolf's lips when Swift Eagle translated. He extended his hand, a gesture adopted from white customs, and Catherine clasped it firmly. Within minutes, the women had gathered their few possessions and prepared to leave. Morning Star appeared with a small deerskin pouch for each of them. Medicine, she explained, pressing one into Catherine's palm. For strength, for healing, for remembering. Catherine embraced the healer, suddenly reluctant to leave these people who had become a surrogate family. Stay safe, she whispered. Morning Star's eyes held ancient wisdom. All paths cross again, sister. This is not an ending. As they slipped away from the camp, Catherine glanced back to see Swift Eagle watching them. He raised his hand in farewell, then turned to help with the evacuation. Morning Star led them along hidden trails, avoiding the main paths where soldiers might patrol. The night was clear and cold, stars punching bright holes in the dark canopy overhead. Their breath formed small clouds in the frozen air, but the exertion of rapid travel kept them warm. "Who are these settlers we're going to?" Rebecca asked as they paused to rest at a small creek. "The Hansons," Morning Star replied. "The man came from a northern land across the Great Water. His wife is Dakota, though she lives as white now. They have no hatred for the people." Catherine was surprised. Mixed marriages were uncommon on the frontier and often met with hostility from both communities. That this couple had managed to establish themselves while maintaining good relations with the Cheyenne spoke to exceptional character. They reached the Hanson homestead shortly before midnight. It was a substantial log cabin, larger than most frontier dwellings, with a well-built barn and corral. A dog announced their arrival with enthusiastic barking, bringing a giant of a man to the door, rifle in hand. "Who goes there?" he demanded, his accent thick and unfamiliar to Catherine's ears. Morning Star stepped forward. "Eric Hansen. It is Morning Star of the Cheyenne, with friends who need shelter." The rifle lowered immediately. "Morning Star, come inside. Anya, we have guests." The cabin's interior was warm and surprisingly comfortable. Hand-woven rugs covered the plank floors, and the furniture, though simple, showed expert craftsmanship. A woman with long black hair streaked with silver, Anya, presumably, hurried forward, her features revealing her native heritage. "Soldiers were here earlier," she informed Morning Star without preamble. "Looking for deserters, they claimed, but their questions suggested otherwise." Eric nodded grimly. "They asked about Cheyenne movements, about white captives. Very interested. In rumors of a woman who survived abandonment in the mountains." And Catherine and the others exchanged alarmed glances. The soldiers were looking specifically for her. "Did you tell them anything?" Rebecca asked, a protective edge to her voice. Eric looked offended. "We know nothing about such matters," I told them. "Only tend our farm and mind our business." Anja's smile was subtle but fierce. They did not think to question a woman with Dakota blood about hiding Cheyenne. Their mistake. After introductions and a brief explanation of their situation, edited to exclude certain details about Edward's crimes, the Hansons insisted on providing food and beds for the night. The women were too exhausted to refuse. While the others settled in, Catherine found herself unable to sleep. She slipped outside onto the cabin's small porch, wrapping a borrowed blanket around her shoulders against the cold. Eric joined her a few minutes later, offering a cup of steaming coffee. "You bear a heavy burden," he observed, his voice surprisingly gentle for such a large man. Catherine accepted the coffee gratefully. "No heavier than many others. Perhaps. But few survive what you have survived." He leaned against the porch railing, gazing out at the starlit landscape. "My Anja understands something of this. Her village was destroyed when she was 16. She alone escaped because she was gathering herbs in the forest. Catherine studied the man's profile, understanding dawning. You saved her. A rumbling chuckle escaped him. No, she saved me. I was a foolish trapper, half dead from infection in my leg. She found me, healed me, then decided I was worth keeping. His expression sobered. But the pain of what she lost never fully leaves her. Some nights, even now, she wakes weeping for her family. Does it get easier? Catherine asked, the question emerging before she could stop it. Eric considered this thoughtfully. Not easier, different. The pain changes shape, becomes part of you rather than something that consumes you. He glanced at her. You will find your way to bear it. You already have strength enough, I think. They fell into comfortable silence, sipping coffee as the night deepened around them. Eventually, Eric returned inside, leaving Catherine alone with her thoughts. The quiet was shattered by the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. Catherine tensed, retreating into the shadow of the cabin's eave. Within moments, a single rider emerged from the tree line, Swift Eagle, his horse lathered from hard riding. Catherine hurried to meet him as he dismounted. What's happened? The soldiers found one of our scouts, he reported, breathless from his journey. They demanded to know where we were camped. When he refused to answer, they beat him. He escaped during the night, but heard their commander mention your name. A cold dread settled in Catherine's stomach. They're looking for me specifically? Why? I do not know, but their questions were not about Edward Wilson or the trial. They asked about a woman who returned from the dead, who might be hiding with Cheyenne. Catherine's mind raced. If not connected to Edward's trial, then why? This sudden interest in her? What possible reason would the military have to track down a supposedly dead frontier woman? There's more, Swift Eagle continued, his expression darkening further. Before escaping, my brother heard them speak of burning our camp when found, claiming we had abducted white women. The implications were horrifying. Not only were these soldiers seeking Catherine for unknown reasons, but they intended to use her as justification for an attack on the very people who had saved her life. Catherine made a swift decision. I need to meet these soldiers myself, away from both your camp and this homestead. If they're looking for me, let them find me, but on my terms, not theirs. Swift Eagle's face registered alarm. It is too dangerous. We do not know their true purpose. Exactly why I need to discover it. Catherine's voice hardened with resolve. I won't allow your people to face violence because of me, not after everything you've done. Eric had emerged from the cabin during their conversation and now joined them, his expression grave. She is right, he told Swift Eagle. Better to meet them on open ground than to wait for them to find her here or with your people. Swift Eagle clearly disliked the plan but recognized its logic. How will you arrange this meeting? Eric rubbed his beard thoughtfully. There is a trading post 3 miles south, Wilcox's place. Neutral ground. Soldiers stop there regularly for supplies. Can you get a message to their commander? Catherine asked. The big man nodded. My neighbor rides there at dawn for tobacco. He can carry word that a woman matching their description will be at Wilcox's tomorrow at midday. Inside the cabin, the other women had awakened and now crowded onto the porch, demanding explanations. When Catherine outlined her plan, their reactions were predictably divided. Absolutely not, Rebecca declared. After everything we've survived, you're walking voluntarily into unknown danger? It's reckless, Mary agreed. At least wait until we know more about why they're searching for you. But Abigail, ever the pragmatist, saw the necessity. If these soldiers intend to use her as an excuse to attack the Cheyenne, she has no choice. Better to face the threat directly than hide while others suffer for it. Grace, who had grown closest to the Cheyenne children during their stay, nodded emphatically. We can't let them burn the camp. We owe them our lives. The debate continued until dawn, but Catherine remained resolute. By morning, a message had been dispatched with Eric's neighbor arranging the meeting at Wilcox's trading post at noon. The women spent the morning preparing, each in their own way. Rebecca wrote out detailed accounts of everything that had happened, creating a documented record in case the worst occurred. Mary checked and cleaned the small derringer they had taken from Edward, insisting Catherine carry it hidden in her boot. Abigail prepared healing sachets and tinctures, anticipating potential need. Grace simply stayed close to Catherine, her young face solemn with concern. As the appointed hour approached, Catherine changed into clothes borrowed from Anya. Simpler garments than the Cheyenne maid attire she had been wearing, but still well-made and respectable. If she was to confront military authorities, she needed to appear as a frontier wife, not as someone who had been living with Native Americans. "I'm coming with you," Swift Eagle announced as she prepared to leave. Catherine shook her head firmly. "If these soldiers intend harm to the Cheyenne, you'd be walking into a trap." "And you would not," he challenged. "I'm supposedly dead," Catherine reminded him. "They can hardly arrest a ghost." Swift Eagle was not convinced. "I will remain hidden but nearby if trouble comes." He touched the knife at his belt. Catherine knew better than to argue further. Swift Eagle's protection had kept her alive more than once. His stubborn loyalty was not something to reject lightly. Eric insisted on driving Catherine to the trading post himself. A woman arriving alone would draw too much attention, he reasoned. As my customer, you raise fewer questions. Anya embraced Catherine before she departed. "Trust your instincts," the older woman advised. "They have served you well so far." The trading post was a substantial log structure situated at a crossroads where several trails converged. As Eric's wagon approached, Catherine noted 6 military horses hitched outside, confirming the soldiers had received her message and arrived for the meeting. "Ready?" Eric asked, bringing the wagon to a halt. Catherine took a deep breath, settling her nerves. "Ready." The interior of the trading post was dim after the bright sunlight outside. The smell of tobacco, leather, and coffee filled the air. Several soldiers stood near the counter, while a man Catherine presumed to be their commander studied a map spread across a barrel top. All conversation ceased as she entered. The commander looked up, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of her appearance. He was younger than Catherine had expected, perhaps 30, with a neatly trimmed beard and the rigid posture of a career military man. "Mrs. Wilson, I presume," he said, folding the map deliberately. Catherine stepped forward, conscious of every eye in the room upon her. "I am Catherine Wilson, yes. And you are?" "Captain James Blackwood, United States Army." He gestured toward a small table in the corner. "Might we speak privately?" Catherine glanced at Eric, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod before busying himself examining merchandise. With feigned confidence, she followed Captain Blackwood to the table. "You're a difficult woman to locate, Mrs. Wilson," the captain began once they were seated, "especially for someone supposedly deceased." "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," Catherine replied coolly. "What I'm curious about, Captain, is why the United States Army has an interest in a frontier woman's supposed demise." Blackwood studied her face intently before responding. "I'm afraid our interest isn't in your survival, impressive though it may be. We're more concerned with who helped ensure that survival." The conversation was taking an unexpected turn. Catherine maintained a neutral expression, waiting for him to continue. "You see, Mrs. Wilson, we've been tracking a particular Cheyenne warrior for some time, a man who calls himself Swift Eagle." Catherine's heart stuttered, but she betrayed no reaction. "I don't understand what this has to do with me." Captain Blackwood leaned forward, his voice dropping. 3 years ago, Swift Eagle was a scout for the army at Fort Laramie. He was privy to military movements, strategies, supply routes. Then, following a disagreement with his commanding officer, he disappeared, taking with him sensitive information. "You're saying he's a deserter?" Catherine asked, genuinely surprised. Swift Eagle had never mentioned working for the military. Worse, a traitor. Blackwood's expression hardened. Since his desertion, several army supply convoys have been ambushed in territories where they should have traveled undetected. Secret routes, known only to a few, including Swift Eagle. Catherine's mind raced. This accusation painted Swift Eagle as a man who had betrayed the army's trust, who might be responsible for soldiers' deaths. It contradicted everything she had come to know about his character. "What does this have to do with me?" she asked, again playing for time. "Witnesses place you in the company of Cheyenne after your supposed death, specifically in the company of a warrior matching Swift Eagle's description." Blackwood's eyes never left her face. "We believe you know where he is, where his camp is located." The captain's true purpose became sickeningly clear. They weren't interested in Catherine at all. She was merely a means to locate Swift Eagle and, by extension, the Cheyenne camp. "I was near death when found wandering in the mountains," Catherine replied carefully. "I never learned the name of the man who rescued me, nor where his people were camped. Once I recovered enough strength, I made my way to Fort Anderson to report my husband's crimes." Blackwood's expression showed he didn't believe her. "Mrs. Wilson, I understand your loyalty to those who saved your life, but Swift Eagle is not the noble savage you may believe him to be. He's responsible for the deaths of at least 12 soldiers, good men with families waiting for them." Catherine maintained her composure with effort. "As I said, I don't know anyone by that name." The captain sighed, reaching into his jacket to withdraw a folded document. "I had hoped for your cooperation, but I'm prepared to proceed without it." He pushed the paper across the table. "This is a warrant for your arrest on charges of aiding a military deserter and providing comfort to hostile Indians." Catherine stared at the document, momentarily speechless. Even if Edward faced justice for his crimes, she now faced imprisonment herself. Not for anything she had done, but for her association with Swift Eagle. "This is absurd," she finally managed. "I've broken no laws." "Harboring a deserter is a serious offense," Blackwood countered, "as is withholding information vital to military operations." Catherine's options were rapidly diminishing. If arrested, she would be unable to warn Swift Eagle or the Cheyenne camp, but if she attempted to flee now, she would only confirm the captain's suspicions. "I'll need time to consider my position," she said, stalling. Blackwood shook his head. "I'm afraid time is a luxury we don't have, Mrs. Wilson. My orders are to locate Swift Eagle and neutralize the threat he poses. I'd prefer to do that with your assistance, but I'm prepared to take you into custody immediately if necessary." The trading post's door opened, admitting a soldier who hurried to the captain's side, whispering urgently in his ear. Blackwood's expression darkened as he listened. "It seems circumstances have changed," he told Catherine, rising abruptly. "My men have spotted a Cheyenne scout watching this building. We'll continue our conversation at Fort Anderson." Before Catherine could react, 2 soldiers flanked her, making it clear she was now in custody. Eric, observing from across the room, took a step forward, but Catherine gave a slight shake of her head. The last thing she needed was for the Hansons to be implicated as well. As the soldiers escorted her outside, Catherine scanned the tree. Lying desperately, praying, Swift Eagle had maintained his distance. Instead, her heart sank as she spotted fresh tracks leading away from a stand of pines, signs of someone departing in haste. They had seen him, and now they would follow. Captain Blackwood organized his men efficiently, assigning 2 to escort Catherine while the others prepared to pursue the Cheyenne scout. The captain himself would lead the pursuit, clearly prioritizing the capture of Swift Eagle over securing his prisoner. "Take her to Fort Anderson," he instructed the soldiers assigned to Catherine. "Lieutenant Mills is expecting her, and be vigilant. She has Cheyenne allies who may attempt a rescue." Catherine was helped onto a horse, her wrists bound loosely. To the saddle horn, secure enough to prevent escape, but not so tight as to cause injury. Eric watched helplessly from the trading post steps, his expression promising he would inform the others as soon as possible. As the soldiers led her, horse away from the trading post, Catherine's mind worked furiously. The scout they had spotted wasn't Swift Eagle himself. He would never have been so careless. It must have been another Cheyenne warrior, perhaps sent to observe the meeting. But now Blackwood and his men would follow those tracks, potentially straight back to the camp. She had to create a diversion to buy time for Swift Eagle to warn his people. But how, with her hands bound and 2 armed soldiers escorting her? The answer came from an unexpected quarter. As they rounded a bend in the trail, a figure burst from the underbrush. Grace, her face streaked with mud for camouflage, wielding a fallen branch like a club. She struck the first soldier's arm with surprising force, causing him to lose his grip on Catherine's horse. The animal, startled by the sudden commotion, reared. Catherine used the momentum to slide from the saddle, landing hard but managing to keep her feet. The second soldier reached for his weapon, but hesitated, unwilling to fire upon a young woman. That hesitation gave Rebecca time to emerge from the opposite side of the trail, a pistol gripped in both hands. "Don't move," she ordered, her schoolteacher's voice carrying unmistakable authority, despite the slight tremor in her hands. Mary appeared next, quickly cutting Catherine's bonds with a knife. "Can you ride?" she asked urgently. Catherine nodded, rubbing circulation back into her wrists. "How did you know?" "Swift Eagle intercepted Eric on the road," Mary explained, already leading her toward a horse concealed in the trees. "He couldn't intervene directly without confirming their suspicions, so he came to us instead." The soldiers had recovered from their initial surprise and now stood tense but motionless, aware that any sudden movement might cause Rebecca to fire. "You're making a grave mistake," one warned. "Interfering with military personnel is a serious offense." "So is unlawful detention of an innocent woman," Rebecca replied steadily. "Mrs. Wilson has committed no crime." Catherine mounted the waiting horse, her heart pounding. Abigail appeared from the forest, leading 2 more horses for Grace and Rebecca. "What about the Cheyenne camp?" Catherine asked as Mary handed her the reins. "Blackwood is tracking someone he believes will lead him there." "Swift Eagle is handling that," Mary assured her. "He said to tell you he's leading the soldiers on a long hunt, whatever that means." Relief flooded Catherine. Swift Eagle would create a false trail, leading Blackwood and his men away from the actual camp location. It was a temporary solution, but it would buy precious time. The standoff with the 2 soldiers couldn't last much longer. Already, one was edging toward his fallen weapon. "What's the plan?" Catherine asked, recognizing they needed to act quickly. "We ride hard for the territorial border," Mary explained. "It's only 15 miles east. Once across, we'll be in Dakota territory outside Blackwood's jurisdiction." It was a desperate gambit, but the only one available. Catherine looked at these women who had repeatedly risked everything for each other. Rebecca, with her trembling but determined grip on the pistol, Grace with her fierce young eyes, Mary with her practical strength, Abigail with her weathered resilience. "We go together," she decided, "all of us." The escape was chaotic. Rebecca fired a warning shot into the air, startling the soldiers, horses, and creating enough confusion for all 5 women to mount and gallop away. They rode hard along a narrow trail Mary had scouted earlier, pushing their horses to the limit of safety through the dense forest. Behind them, they heard the soldiers' shouts fading into the distance, but Catherine knew their reprieve would be temporary. Once the soldiers reported to Blackwood, the full patrol would abandon the chase for Swift Eagle and focus on recapturing her. The race to the territorial border became a desperate flight through increasingly unfamiliar terrain. Mary led with confidence, born of careful preparation. She had clearly studied their escape route thoroughly, anticipating this outcome even when the others had hoped for a peaceful resolution. "There's a river crossing 5 miles ahead," she called over her shoulder as they paused briefly to rest the horses. "Once across, we'll be less than 10 miles from the border." "And then what?" Grace asked, the adrenaline of their escape giving way to practical concerns. "We can't keep running forever." It was the question they all faced, but had been too focused on immediate survival to address. What future remained for 5 women branded as fugitives? "One problem at a time," Abigail counseled. "First the border, then we'll decide our next move." The river crossing proved more challenging than anticipated. Spring melt had swollen the waters, making the ford deeper and more treacherous than Mary had expected. The horses balked at the rushing current, requiring coaxing and firm handling to enter the water. Midway across, Catherine's mount lost its footing on the slick riverbed. For one heart-stopping moment, both rider and horse floundered in the current. Then Swift Eagle was there, materializing as if from the water itself, his strong hand gripping her horse's bridle and guiding it safely to the opposite bank. "How?" Catherine gasped, water streaming from her sodden clothing as she dismounted. "I led the soldiers on a false trail, then doubled back," he explained, helping the others across. They followed tracks that lead in circles for many miles. The reunion was brief but joyous. Swift Eagle confirmed that the Cheyenne camp had relocated safely deeper into the mountains, beyond Blackwood's reach for now, but the danger was far from over. "The captain is no fool," Swift Eagle warned as they continued their journey. "He will realize the deception soon, and now he has even more reason to pursue us." "Because of me," Catherine said, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on her shoulders. Her involvement had transformed Swift Eagle from a deserter into an active enemy in Blackwood's eyes, someone who had now interfered with military operations by helping her escape. Swift Eagle's expression remained unreadable. "My quarrel with the Bluecoats began long before you. Do not claim my burden as your own." Catherine wanted to press for details about his history with the army, to understand the accusations Blackwood had made. But now was not the time for such questions. Survival remained their priority. As dusk approached, they reached a ridgeline overlooking a vast expanse of prairie. Swift Eagle halted, pointing to a distant line of trees. "There lies the border to Dakota Territory," he said. "Beyond those trees, Blackwood's authority ends." Hope surged within Catherine. They might actually escape, not just from Edward's treachery, but from this new, unexpected threat. Then came the sound they had dreaded, hoofbeats approaching. From behind, the distinctive rhythm of military horses moving at speed. Blackwood had seen through the deception and guessed their destination. "Ride!" Swift Eagle commanded, urgency sharpening his voice. "Do not stop until you cross the border!" The women spurred their exhausted horses forward, charging down the slope toward the distant tree line marking the Dakota Territory. Catherine glanced back to see Swift Eagle remaining on the ridge, bow in hand. "What are you doing?" she called, reining in her mount. "Go!" he insisted. "I will slow them." Realization struck with horrifying clarity. He intended to face Blackwood's patrol alone, sacrificing himself to ensure their escape. One man against 6 trained soldiers. "No!" Catherine wheeled her horse around, deaf to the protests of the other women. "I won't let you die for me." Swift Eagle's expression softened momentarily. "It is my choice, Cat." Before she could respond, Rebecca appeared at her side. "He's right about one thing. We need to keep moving, but together." She raised her voice to include Swift Eagle. "All of us." The approaching hoofbeats grew louder. They had moments, not minutes, to decide. Mary pointed toward a rocky outcropping jutting from the hillside. "There, we can make a stand with better cover." It wasn't ideal, but it offered more protection than the exposed ridge. Swift Eagle hesitated only briefly before nodding his agreement. Together, they raced toward the outcropping, reaching its shelter just as Captain Blackwood and his men crested the ridge they had vacated. "They've spotted us," Grace reported, peering through a gap in the rocks. Abigail, breathing heavily from the exertion, pressed a hand to her side. "I'm slowing you down. Perhaps if I surrender the rest of you, no more talk of sacrifice." Catherine cut her off firmly. "We've survived this far by staying together." Swift Eagle positioned himself at the edge of their shelter, assessing the approaching soldiers with a tactician's eye. "They will surround us. 6 men, 6 directions of approach. What do we do?" Grace asked, fear evident in her young voice despite her best efforts to conceal it. Catherine met Swift Eagle's gaze, a silent communication passing between them. They were trapped, outnumbered, with their backs to a sheer drop. Fighting meant certain death, surrender meant imprisonment at best. Then Mary spoke, her practical mind finding the one option they hadn't considered. "We negotiate." "With Blackwood?" Catherine scoffed. "He's already shown his hand. He wants Swift Eagle more than justice." "Then give him what he wants," Mary replied calmly, or rather, the appearance of it. Understanding dawned across their faces as Mary outlined her audacious plan. It was dangerous, dependent on precise timing and Blackwood's predictable behavior, but it was their only chance. Captain Blackwood halted his men at a cautious distance from the outcropping. "Mrs. Wilson," he called, "you're surrounded with nowhere to go. Surrender now and I give my word you'll be treated fairly." Catherine stepped partially into view, hands raised to show she carried no weapon. "I want to speak with you, Captain. Alone." Blackwood hesitated, suspecting a trap. "Send out the Cheyenne first." "He's not here," Catherine lied smoothly. "He led us this far, then continued east. But I have information about his destination, information I'll only share with you privately." The captain's ambition warred visibly with his caution. The chance to capture Swift Eagle, a prize that would significantly advance his career, proved too tempting to resist. "Very well," he agreed, dismounting. "Halfway, unarmed." Catherine nodded and began picking her way down from the outcropping. Behind her, concealed by rocks, Swift Eagle nocked an arrow while Mary and Rebecca positioned themselves with clear lines of sight. The meeting point was a small clearing between the soldiers and the outcropping. Catherine arrived first, standing, tall despite her exhaustion and fear. Blackwood approached moments later, his hand conspicuously away from his holstered pistol. "This is your last chance to avoid serious charges, Mrs. Wilson," he began without preamble. "Where is Swift Eagle heading?" Catherine took a deep breath. "Before I tell you, I need assurances for myself and my companions." "You're hardly in a position to negotiate," Blackwood pointed out, though his tone remained surprisingly civil. "On the contrary," Catherine countered. "You've pursued Swift Eagle for 3 years without success. I'm offering you his location." "That's worth something." The captain studied her, weighing her sincerity. "What do you want? Safe passage for me and my friends across the border? No pursuit? No charges?" Blackwood's laugh was short and humorless. "You're asking me to ignore my duty. I'm asking you to fulfill your primary mission, capturing Swift Eagle, while recognizing that 5 women who survived abandonment and attempted murder deserve better than imprisonment for accepting help where it was offered." The captain's expression revealed his internal conflict. His orders were to capture both Swift Eagle and those who had aided him, but the opportunity to claim the greater prize was clearly tempting. "How do I know you're not simply buying time?" he demanded. Catherine met his gaze steadily. "Because Swift Eagle saved my life when my own husband left me to die. I owe him everything, and yet I'm willing to give you his location. That should tell you how desperate I am to secure safety for these women." It was a convincing performance because it contained threads of truth. Catherine did owe Swift Eagle her life. She was desperate to protect the other women. Blackwood seemed to reach a decision. "Very well. Tell me where he's heading, and I'll allow you and your companions safe passage to Dakota territory, but only after we've verified your information." Catherine nodded as if accepting his terms. He spoke of a sacred cave system near Thunder Creek. His people have used it as a sanctuary for generations. There's an entrance hidden behind a waterfall. He intended to meet us there after ensuring we cross the border safely. The captain's eyes gleamed with anticipated victory. This specific detail, a location he could pursue immediately, convinced him of her sincerity. "Thunder Creek," he repeated. "When will he arrive there?" "Nightfall," Catherine replied. "He travels faster alone." Blackwood nodded, satisfied. "You and your companions will remain under guard until we've verified this information. If it proves accurate, you'll be released at the border as agreed." Catherine allowed a carefully calculated look of resignation to cross her face. "I understand." And then as they turned to walk back to their respective positions, Catherine gave a subtle hand signal. Instantly, chaos erupted from multiple directions. Swift Eagle loosed an arrow that embedded itself in the ground inches from Blackwood's boot, freezing him in place. Simultaneously, Rebecca fired a pistol shot skyward, while Grace and Mary created a diversion on the opposite side of the clearing, by sending a cascade of rocks tumbling down the hillside. In the momentary confusion, Swift Eagle swept down from the outcropping, seizing Catherine around the waist and pulling her onto his horse. The other women emerged from their hiding places, already mounted and ready. "Now!" Swift Eagle shouted. They charged directly toward the most lightly defended section of Blackwood's perimeter, where only one soldier stood between them and the path to Dakota territory. The startled man barely had time to raise his rifle before they were upon him, forcing him to dive aside or be trampled. Blackwood recovered quickly, shouting orders as he ran for his horse. "After them! Don't let them reach the border!" The chase was frantic, desperate. 5 exhausted horses carrying 6 passengers pursued by fresh military mounts. Under normal circumstances, they would have been overtaken within minutes. But these were not normal circumstances, and the border was less than a mile away. Swift Eagle's horse, carrying double weight, began to lag despite his expert horsemanship. Seeing this, Mary slowed alongside them. "Take my horse," she shouted to Catherine. "It's faster with a single rider." Before Catherine could protest, Swift Eagle had helped transfer her to Mary's mount. Mary swung up behind Rebecca, and they continued their mad dash for freedom. The border approached, a simple wooden marker beside the trail, identifying the boundary between Wyoming and Dakota territories. Beyond it lay jurisdiction different enough to give Blackwood pause, at least temporarily. Bullets whizzed overhead as the soldiers began firing, aiming high in an apparent attempt to frighten. Rather than kill, it served only to spur the fleeing horses to greater speed. The border marker flashed past, first for Catherine, then Grace, then Rebecca and Mary, and finally Swift Eagle. They had crossed into Dakota territory, but Blackwood showed no signs of halting his pursuit. "He's not stopping!" Grace cried, glancing back. Swift Eagle made a swift decision. "The river!" he called, pointing to where the trail forked ahead. "Left path!" They veered onto the left-hand trail, which descended sharply toward a river gorge. The sound of rushing water grew louder as they approached, suggesting a significant waterway rather than a small stream. The trail ended abruptly at a riverbank, the water running swift and deep between steep rock walls. Across the churning expanse, perhaps 30 feet away, the opposite shore offered dense forest cover, perfect for disappearing from pursuit. "We can't cross that," Rebecca protested, eyeing the surging current. Swift Eagle dismounted quickly. Downstream 50 paces, there are stones, a shallow path. Indeed, a line of partially submerged rocks created a tenuous crossing point, visible only to those who knew where to look. Not a proper ford, but passable to careful travelers, and completely invisible from the trail above. "The horses can't make it," Mary observed grimly. "We go on foot," Swift Eagle confirmed. "The horses will return home without riders. The soldiers will follow their tracks away from here." It was a desperate gambit, but their only remaining option as Blackwood's patrol drew nearer. Quickly, they dismounted, removing all identifying possessions from the saddles. Swift Eagle whispered something to each horse before sending them galloping back up the trail, directly toward the approaching soldiers, but veering off on a game path that paralleled the river. The crossing was perilous, each step requiring absolute concentration. The rocks were slick with spray, the current powerful enough to sweep away anyone who faltered. Swift Eagle led the way, testing each stone before signaling the others to follow. Catherine helped Abigail, whose arthritic hands made balancing precarious. Rebecca and Mary assisted Grace, forming a human chain against the river's relentless pull. They were halfway across when Blackwood and his men arrived at the riverbank. The captain surveyed the scene with a thunderous expression, immediately recognizing the deception. "There!" one of his men shouted, pointing to where the group struggled across the treacherous rocks. Blackwood raised his rifle, hesitated, then lowered it again. Even at this distance, Catherine could read the conflict in his posture. They were in Dakota territory now, beyond his jurisdiction. Firing upon them would constitute a serious breach of military protocol, possibly even murder. For a breathless moment, soldiers and fugitives stared at each other across the churning water. Then Blackwood made his decision, turning to his men and issuing orders Catherine couldn't hear over the river's roar. "What's he doing?" Grace called anxiously. "Sending men to find a crossing point," Swift Eagle replied, urging them forward. "Hurry!" With renewed urgency, they completed the crossing, stumbling onto the far bank just as two soldiers began making their way downstream, presumably searching for an easier ford. The dense forest beckoned, offering concealment and safety. As they pushed into the protective embrace of the trees, Catherine glanced back one last time. Captain Blackwood remained on the opposite bank, watching them disappear. Their eyes met briefly across the divide, hers defiant, his resigned. Then the forest closed around them and he was gone from view. They traveled until nightfall, pushing deeper into Dakota territory with each step. Swift Eagle moved with confidence through the unfamiliar landscape, leading them away from likely pursuit routes. When they finally stopped to rest in a small clearing, the exhaustion of their desperate flight caught up with them all at once. "Will he follow?" Rebecca asked, voicing everyone's concern. Swift Eagle considered this question carefully. "Not immediately. He must report to his superiors, explain crossing territorial boundaries. By then, our trail will be cold." "So we're safe?" Grace's hopeful question hung in the air. "For now," Catherine answered honestly, "but we can't return to Wyoming territory, not while Blackwood remains at Fort Anderson." The reality of their situation settled over the group. They were alive and free, but at the cost of everything familiar. Their pasts, their homes, their very identities lay behind them now. Abigail broke the somber silence with a dry chuckle. "Oh well, it wouldn't be the first time we've started over from nothing, would it, ladies?" The simple truth of her statement lightened the mood considerably. They had indeed rebuilt from nothing before, first after being cast out by Pinecrest, then after fleeing the cave. This was merely another beginning. As the others discussed practical matters of immediate survival, Catherine drew Swift Eagle aside. "Was it true?" she asked quietly. "What Blackwood said about you deserting the army, taking military information?" Swift Eagle met her gaze steadily. "I was a scout at Fort Laramie. I guided soldiers through Cheyenne lands." His expression darkened. "Then I led them to a village they promised to negotiate with. Instead, they attacked at dawn. Women, children, slaughtered while they slept." Catherine's hand flew to her mouth in horror. "I left that night," he continued, "took nothing but knowledge, patrol routes, supply schedules, information that helped my people avoid further massacres." His eyes challenged her to judge him. "Would you call that betrayal?" "I'd call it justice," Catherine replied without hesitation. Something tight in Swift Eagle's posture relaxed at her words. He had feared her judgment, she realized, valued her opinion enough to worry about her reaction to his past. "What happens now?" she asked, gazing eastward, as if the future might be visible on the horizon. Swift Eagle followed her gaze. "My people have relatives among the Dakota. They would welcome us." He paused, the invitation implicit in his words. "Us," Catherine repeated softly, testing the word and all it implied. For so long, her focus had been survival, then justice. Edward's betrayal had left no room for considering a future beyond mere existence. But now, with Edward facing trial and the immediate danger behind them, possibilities stretched before her like an uncharted wilderness, frightening in its vastness, exhilarating in its freedom. "We survived," she said, echoing Mary's earlier words. "We're free." Swift Eagle's hand found hers, his calloused fingers intertwining with her own. "The path ahead is yours to choose." As dawn broke over their makeshift camp, Catherine watched, her companions stir. These extraordinary women who had defied death and convention to forge their own destinies. Whatever paths they chose next, they would walk them not as victims, but as survivors, not as discarded things, but as women of unbending strength. The morning light painted the eastern sky with promises of new beginnings. Catherine stepped forward, to meet it, ready at last to leave winter behind. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.